それじゃあ任務を振り分けるね。出発するよ。隠密行動を心がけてね。いい、ここだよ。あれ、私の出番？あれ、どこに行くの？あれ、どこに行くの？結果さえ伴うならちょっと苦労するのも悪くないね。
She invited me over again. When I got to her house, she was naked and really horny. We had sex until dawn. And then, she made me breakfast and we took a long hot shower.
Hey guys, so I'm hoping that the majority of you have seen my recent main channel upload by now where I talked about my experience with Manscaped. I think this might be kind of fun, maybe not. I decided I'd maybe try like reading some of the comments on my recent main channel uploads and see if I can give you some replies, give you maybe some more info or answer some of your questions or just shoot the shit with you guys in the best way I possibly can through comments. Let me know what you think, and let's begin. So, the video's been doing great, by the way. Appreciate all you guys watching. Thank you very much. I'm drunk right now, but Mr. GG comes first. Don't know why that got so many upvotes, but it did. And then everybody else, all the other 67 replies, everybody else was like, yeah, dude, I'm fucking hammered right now. Yeah, dude, I'm crossfaded right now. You, I'm packing a bowl right now. You, I just shot up meth. Helix is kind of wild for sponsoring this video. They've just sided with someone hating on one of the bigger YouTube sponsors. LOL, I respect that. Helix didn't know what I was going to talk about in this video. It's not always guaranteed that I tell a sponsor what the video's about before it goes live. The Helix didn't necessarily sign off on it or anything like that. I'm not saying that to take credit away from them. I'm just, you know, just so we all know the truth about things right now. But, still a great bed. Joseph Taboro says, I'm the CMO of one of the companies that sponsor Gigi, and I can tell you this, Manscaped is out of their mind. Gigi is not only the person I've worked with influencer-wise, but I can attest to the fact that his integrations perform above and beyond our expectations every time. We've done integrations with larger creators with the right numbers, but still this man is on top. I might have read this one on purpose. But Joseph works with Fans Global. If you guys have seen any of my Fans Global ads. Oh, hey, I'm sorry. Did I rudely interrupt your video? What are you gonna do? Cry about it, pussy? I say whatever the fuck I want and do whatever the fuck I want in the ads. It's a lot of fun, and I feel like people respect that. A lot of sponsors will say, we want you to be as creative as possible. We want you to be you. But sometimes you might be a little too fucking nuts. Sometimes you might make really inappropriate jokes. 2 birds, 1 rock. Hard dick on the other side of the screen. So that video they originally sponsored, nobody knew it would get 2 million views. So I get why they may make a less impressive offer at first. But when Gigi only ends up making around 10K from that video over 2 years, not all at once, from YouTube. Do you honestly think it's reasonable asking for 10K as well from the sponsor for 1/30th of the video? As much as his video has made from YouTube in totality over the 2 years? I'm not sure I understand that question. Because I made 10K from it on AdSense, I don't ask for my AdSense. But let me read this. Maybe there's an ROI nuance I'm missing here, but from a business perspective, their approach, besides a PayPal BS, seems reasonable. I couldn't imagine their ROI being more than he asked in a case like this, or that waiting 2 years for 2 million views would even be worth. Yes, I know he fudged numbers, but I'm working with what he is. I like Gigi a lot, but this sounds like overvaluation of self and lack awareness for the reality for these companies. Nobody gets anywhere by spending too much on a gamble and potentially not making a return. I'm sure there are bad sponsors, and this may be one of them, but without the real numbers, it's hard to know. I've never bought anything from a sponsor on YouTube or any other social media, so I'm genuinely curious because I'm not invested, but this was a whole lot of complaining for something kind of petty. I understand that viewpoint. I guess what I'm more so trying to say is, I think there's a lot you cannot take into consideration regarding return on investment, and I think a lot of that can be what you can do for a brand that is not a direct sale. If I tell you about a brand, and now people know about it, the brand is winning, just like everything on here, just like my channel. I want you to talk about my channel. I want you to know about my channel. A lot of other channels, and something I'm not great at, push themselves in your face constantly, so you keep thinking about them. They post on everything. They have to stay relevant on everything to survive, essentially. And it's the same shit with a company. A lot of the times, their sales may not boom because they sponsored Markiplier, but now 2 million people just thought of Honey and said, oh yeah, Honey is an app that can help me save money at checkout. Return on investment is not always immediate. Often, at least for me, I've gave money to a lot of the companies that sponsor YouTubers, right? But it hasn't been right after I watched a video always, you know, because Drew Gooden talks about HelloFresh. I'm not immediately like, you know what? Yeah, I would like 2 meals the next week. But it's something that looms in my mind. And then when I'm like, oh, I do want HelloFresh, actually, I'll try and go get a discount from a YouTuber that's advertising it. But then chances are his code might be expired. I just buy HelloFresh anyways. And there is no way to track that. Back to that. There is no way to be like, well, the seed that Drew Gooden planted was the reason why Mr. Gigi purchased HelloFresh 2 months later. I will still get messages from people saying, hey, does your code still work on this? Months later. Like you said, there's a lot of nuance there. I know I'm missing a portion of the argument, but from my perspective, that's how I would explain it. I hope that was at least a more direct response to that. The sheer balls of going so in depth with this specific topic is incredible. So impressed with providing this behind the scenes look. It's so important for viewers to understand what goes into running a channel, and folks need to be aware of this kind of behavior. I kind of like this response from some creators that responded to the video, and also some fellow creators that watched the video and reached out to me. I liked having some smaller creators reach out and be like, hey, this is really useful advice. I'm just getting into the sponsor world. Like, it's a scary fucking place if you don't know what you're doing. A lot of the times when you're in that beginning portion of the sponsor world, it's like, yo, I'll take anything I can get. That's not a bad mentality to have. It's such an exciting, crazy thing. It's a rush. It's almost like this weird validation that it's working, even if it is coming from companies that, yeah, might be scummy, but there's a lot of great companies too. I said it in the video. I worked with a lot of great companies. They've been more good than bad. I know from experience too, it's nice to just hear someone else's experience with sponsors because you only have yours. Creators aren't openly talking about sponsors, and I'm not trying to be the fucking hero of the bunch of like, oh, I stepped up and I was able and I spoke my mind. A lot of creators do it. It's nothing special, but it is comforting to hear other creators talk about sponsors sometimes because not only can you relate, but then also you hear different perspectives, you hear advice. The Click commented, he said, called it. Great video, though my experience with them was brief, it was very unpleasant. Keep the content rolling. Yeah, me and Click have talked about Manscaped. So, thanks for this behind-the-scenes look about dealing with a bad sponsor. F Manscaped for not paying what you deserve. This situation really sucked for you, but it's really interesting to hear about. And that's kind of another comment that I got. It's just people being like, oh, it's so interesting to hear when you talk about behind-the-scenes sponsorship shit. Because like I said, it's not super openly talked about, and I understand why it's not super openly talked about. I didn't want to start this fucking riot and be like, cancel Manscaped, don't buy their products. That wasn't my goal. It's just like, hey, I just want to talk about this. The medicated artist said, this and Drew Gooden's weird ad buy and try have made me really grateful about the rise in transparency between creators and their audience about sponsorships. I think he talked about Magic Spoon. Then he also had a hilarious dig at Honey randomly in one of those videos, I think. At times, with certain products, you'll be able to tell that I'm a bit more blatant. I'm a bit more like, it's a good fucking product. Like, I don't know what else to tell you. Like, I don't even really need to sell this to you. And a lot of great companies that have great products. A lot of great products that I use often. Not just Fleshlight, you fucking weirdos, okay? There was others. They're probably in one of the comments. A lot of the comments were talking about another creator. I think their series is called How Not to Do Business. Oh, fuck, I'm blanking out on their name. Watch the video. They had brought up a great point in the video. When creators get products, it is easy to be a bit biased with how much you like the product because you got it for free. Trying to take that bias out is important because would you actually pay for it if you didn't get it for free? And for some companies, yes. It's weird that I feel weird complimenting companies because, like, well, you're not paying me right now. I've purchased HelloFresh before I've gotten sponsored. I used the HelloFresh when I got sponsored. I will be purchasing HelloFresh after I'm not sponsored anymore. You know, which I'm not. Other products? Not really. Eternally Toast said, alright, I was not prepared for that final ratio. No fucking way those clowns dropped the rating anymore. While still asking for more from you. You made the right call, and hopefully other creators wise enough to do the same. For me, it was more of like disrespect, but also my dumbass took emotion into it. I'm like, hey, as long as we take care of each other in the end, like, I'm cool with it. And then that was obvious. That was never actually the plan. Because it's a business. Oh, no, he might be desperate. But thankfully, I was not at that point. Suit Doggy said, Manscaped literally sponsors everyone. I know they're marketing so much that when you mentioned they were the worst, I was genuinely surprised. Now I'm going to have a bad taste in my mouth whenever I see them. So, sponsor. It would not be shocking for a creator to reach out to me and be like, hey, actually, I've had nothing but great experiences with Manscaped. That's dope. Happy for you. I'm happy you didn't go down this road. Ace of Shark said, having recently been screwed out of 19 hours of overtime pay, I feel this in my soul. That's criminal, my guy. Wow, I don't really get to interact with a lot of sponsors, so I had no idea they were so bad, but yikes, sorry you had to go through that, man. Just want to jump in real quick. Not all sponsors. When I was still growing as a channel, I had really great numbers on all my uploads, but details regarding my sub count and upload schedule always had people skeptical and working together with me. And now I really have to fight to get even a fraction of what everyone tells me I'm worth. Tough out there in the content game, but hopefully we all get our bag. Hopefully we all get our bag. Indeed, pantsless pajamas. Some of the things that have bothered me, and this particular thing has not happened often, but I've had a company like look at like my past 5 videos and be like, your average views per video is 200,000. And it's like, oh, there's one random stinker in the bunch that got like 98k views, and I can easily explain to you why I got 98k views, because it's just like completely something different from my other content. Yeah, I knew that one was gonna not do great, but then they weigh it in there and bring down your 300,000 average, and they're like, but no, it's kind of doo-doo though. It's like, honestly shocked at the level of unprofessionalism to reach out after we need proof you can perform so we can pay at a higher rate to lowball you. That was kind of thing I was like sad about, right? Let's like, hey, like, test, we need to throw you in the test run. Right, you did the test run. I fucking went bananas, right? Yeah, you did. But Smokey Glow did a video a few years back about YouTube sponsorships and how she got screwed over early in her career. Manscaped aren't the only bad ones out there. There are a lot of bad ones. It sounds like you also got them at a particularly bad time when there were lots of cuts. Any large company like this, shit about creators. If you heard one bad story with somebody, I will say, I wouldn't necessarily agree with making it so black and white that, like, they're terrible, they must be horrible. It's possible someone had a bad interaction with them, while the other 99% of creators have had great interactions with them. Just like any company, someone has had a terrible experience with them, someone has had great experience with them. You know, like, I was gonna say Xfinity. That's a terrible example because Xfinity is dog shit doo-doo ass. But I'm sure someone has Xfinity out there and they're like, yeah, no, it's actually not that bad, even though I doubt it. Just Flem said, if a sponsor doesn't let you read the ad let you wrap the ad read, is it even worth it? Which is very funny, very good. Ashkin's Curl said, as a small creator, this was so helpful. I just started getting sponsorships in the last year and I've already experienced several instances of payment and rate fuckery. There's so little info and transparency for creators to know where to start with rates, and so many companies take advantage of this. Really sorry you had to go through these mind games with the company. Glad you have sponsors that appreciate and see that awesomeness in your value. Here's to many more to come. That was a very kind comment, Ashkins. I appreciate that. And you have any questions? I'm not promising that I'm the all-knowing sponsor king here, but I'd be more than willing to help you out with any questions on that. You know, and that goes for any small creators. I've had small creators reach out to me. I don't know. This is just me kind of rambling here, just talking to some of the comments. If you guys like this kind of
出発するよ。隠密行動を心がけてね。
The term meme was introduced into the English lexicon in 1976 by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. It is understood to be the cultural parallel to the biological gene, or to put it simply, memes are cultural information carried and shared between people. They can both replicate and possess the ability to evolve or mutate at random as they spread. And the idea of memes have existed within the Metal Gear series since the Solid games, with it even being the main theme of Metal Gear Solid 2 and Raiden's own character. Though, if there's one other character who has openly bathed himself in the concept, it would have to be the masked mellow magnet manipulating mafioso mindfully managed
insecurities will always be your worst enemy, because one impression can turn the one you adore into a poison desire, abnormal creation. I can never think straight, cause she never loved me anyway. I just want you to fade away, because I can't escape my hate. Seeing everything in black and gray, because I can't escape my hate. She told me that I was the reason. I'm always blaming myself for never leaving. I'm so weak, I'm so beat, and I'm freezing, and I fear the empty.
Last time, Artifexian helped me create an alien planet, as well as its star, moon, orbital characteristics, atmosphere, and tectonics. Now that we know all the abiotic factors present on this planet, we can begin creating some life forms to inhabit it. There are many methods for going about doing this, but here we're going to start right at the beginning of the planet's history and evolve an entire biosphere. Of course, creating a fully fleshed out biosphere is a massive undertaking, so this will just serve as a pretty broad overview on how the principles of evolution can be used to design scientifically feasible alien life forms. So then, let's get to work. After the planet consolidates and the oceans form, the world remains a fairly quiet place for quite a while. At some point within the first billion years of the planet's existence, life arises deep within the ocean. The exact mechanism of how life comes about is still not fully understood, but as it proliferates, it begins to affect many aspects of the planet itself. In the history of Earth, the earliest organisms were most likely heterotrophic, meaning they were incapable of producing their own energy and thus had to take up nutrients from the environment. That is, they had to eat things. However, at some point very soon after life first appeared, an evolutionary innovation occurred in which some early groups of microbes evolved the ability to use inorganic molecules to power chemical processes from which they derived their energy. Organisms capable of doing this are called autotrophs, and include phototrophs, like plants and cyanobacteria, which use sunlight to power their metabolism, as well as chemotrophs, like extremophile bacteria that gain energy from geochemically produced sulfides. These autotrophic mechanisms seem to have arisen numerous times in unrelated lineages, so it's likely that autotrophy will evolve in some of the primitive microbes on our alien planet as well. Photosynthetic organisms may evolve to use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars and oxygen, but also, Thanks to the high proportion of hydrogen sulfide in the atmosphere, sulfur-oxidizing chemotrophs may thrive as well, whereas on Earth these chemotrophs are restricted to areas like geothermal vents. On our alien planet, they may also flourish in surface waters. Additionally, hydrogen sulfide dissolves in water, which will cause the oceans to acidify, so these early life forms will likely have some means of tolerating the acid, much like acidophile bacteria on Earth. As these autotrophs proliferate, they'll start to change the composition of the atmosphere, as the phototrophs convert the carbon dioxide into oxygen, and the chemotrophs turn the hydrogen sulfide into elemental sulfur. And as atmospheric oxygen increases, it has a profound effect on the development of life. Oxygen is highly reactive, which makes it great for powering biochemistry. This results in the evolution of aerobic respiration, in some ways the counterpart of photosynthesis, taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. While other forms of respiration do exist, aerobic respiration is almost always the most efficient form. Once aerobic respiration evolves, we'll soon get complex colonial and eventually multicellular organisms, until eventually we come to a critical point in the planet's natural history. For most of its existence, life on Earth mainly comprised simple, soft-bodied creatures, with evolutionary changes taking place very gradually over vast stretches of time. But then, about 4 billion years into the Earth's lifetime, there was suddenly a huge burst of biodiversity called the Cambrian Explosion, wherein the ancestors of virtually every modern animal body plan appear in the fossil record, all within a span of only about 25 million years, which is pretty negligible in the timescale of natural history. While there were certainly many factors at play here, one element that may have contributed to this event was the evolution of predation. Before this point, an organism could get away with just blindly floating about at the mercy of the ocean currents, passively obtaining oxygen and nutrients from the water. There's no real need to deviate from this lifestyle, so there's no real pressure to evolve anything new. But with the advent of active predators, you're not going to last very long if you don't have some form of defense mechanism. This leads to the evolution of the first armor, the first defensive behaviors, and the first eyes. And this then puts an impetus on the predators to evolve some way around their prey's defenses, and this arms race then escalates, dramatically increasing the rate at which life diversifies. It's quite likely that the appearance of predators will trigger an analogue to the Cambrian explosion on our alien planet. So we'll say that around the 4 billion year mark, our previously simple, soft-bodied ecosystems will suddenly diversify into a huge number of new phyla. While difficult to define precisely, a phylum is a lineage of life forms in possession of a shared or related body plan. For example, insects, arachnids, myriapods, and crustaceans all belong to the phylum Arthropoda, meaning they all evolved from a single common ancestor whose body plan they adapted in various ways. So our first step ancestor whose body plan and they adapted in various ways. So our first step is to design some basic body plans. These don't need to be perfect, or even necessarily representative of any one species. What we're looking for here is a rough blueprint that serves as an outline for our creature's anatomy and lifestyle. While there's a lot of scope for variation, we can figure out what makes for a functional body plan by looking at some of the trends in phyla that exist on Earth. Let's compare a typical vertebrate body plan, like that of a dog, with a typical arthropod body plan, like that of an ant. Now, superficially, these two animals may seem quite different, but they also show some pretty striking similarities. They both have a symmetrical body, with limbs used for locomotion, a distinct head that contains a brain and bears the sensory organs and the mouth, and a body containing internal organ systems, such as a heart that pumps oxygen-rich blood around the body, and a digestive tract that runs from one end of the animal to the other. All of these characteristics are especially remarkable, considering the last common ancestor of these two animals looked something like this. This means that all of the above traits were evolved independently within these two body plans, suggesting that such characteristics readily arise in unrelated groups in response to similar evolutionary pressures, what's known as convergent evolution. And if these traits can evolve multiple times on Earth, then why not on an alien planet as well? Now, this doesn't mean that all body plans have to be built along these lines, but it recalls one of my personal world-building mottos: know the rules before you break the rules. In other words, make sure you understand why something is the way it is in the real world before changing it in a fictional world. So then, why is it beneficial to have these traits? To find out, let's create some sample body plans step by step and see what characteristics emerge. To start off, complex multicellular animals most often exhibit some form of symmetry. Some animals, like starfish, anemones, and jellyfish, exhibit radial symmetry, in which the body is arranged in a circle around a central axis, while other animals, like mollusks, arthropods, and vertebrates, demonstrate bilateral symmetry, where the two sides of the body are mirror images of each other. Let's create two body plans, one with radial symmetry and the other with bilateral symmetry. This already has some implications for these animals' biology. On Earth, most radially symmetrical creatures tend to be slow-moving, largely immobile, or sometimes completely sessile, while many animals that are bilaterally symmetrical display a high degree of mobility. Now, it could be that radial phyla on Earth just happen to have never evolved to become very motile, or it could be that having bilateral symmetry is advantageous for a motile lifestyle. We'll touch more on this later, but for now, let's play it safe and make our radially symmetrical plan sessile, and our bilaterally symmetrical one motile. Sessile animals have the difficult task of acquiring oxygen and nutrients without moving, relying on the ocean currents to bring food and oxygen to them. These animals will typically have a surface through which they can absorb oxygen from the surrounding water, which may double as a means of catching plankton or other food particles. Obviously, the larger this surface is, the more food and oxygen the animal can obtain. However, if we enlarge the surface by simply scaling the creature up in size, we run into a problem. The larger something is, the greater its volume becomes relative to its surface area, which means that as our radial life form gets larger, the smaller its feeding surface becomes in proportion to its increasingly large body, lowering overall feeding efficiency. This relationship between surface area and volume is known as the square cube law, and it's a fundamental principle that has numerous ramifications for how life evolves. And keep it in mind because we're going to be referencing it a lot throughout this series. Our radial body plan will therefore need maximum surface area while minimizing volume. This favors a flat, leaf-like, or perhaps feather-like structure, much like sea pens and sea fans on Earth. And since this creature has radial symmetry, perhaps it has a circle of these structures in a flower-like arrangement. Meanwhile, our bilateral body plan presents a different set of parameters. It will also need some method of gaining oxygen from the water, but if it's an active, motile animal, having a large feathery surface for gas exchange would increase drag, making swimming less efficient. This means its gills need to have maximum surface area while also being hydrodynamically optimal. This may favor a long and thin body with gills running down the sides. One innovation that might come in handy here is segmentation or serial repetition, the dividing of a body plan into a series of identical or near-identical units. Perhaps the most obvious real-world examples being arthropods and annelids, but technically, even vertebrates can be considered segmented, for reasons that we'll get into later. For now, let's say our bilaterian has 9 segments, with each segment possessing a pair of limbs and a gill surface. Perhaps it swims with back and forth strokes of its paddle-like limbs, which will have the added benefit of encouraging water over the gills and increasing oxygen intake. Being motile requires a lot more energy than being sessile, so this animal will need an efficient way of transporting this oxygen around the body, and this may come in the form of blood. Blood has evolved as a means of transporting oxygen and nutrients in many different animal groups on Earth, and comes in a variety of chemical variants. However, many blood-bearing animals don't contain blood in arteries and veins, but rather use what's called an open circulatory system, in which the internal organs are surrounded by a blood-filled cavity or hemocoel. This isn't quite as efficient as a closed circulatory system like those found in vertebrates and cephalopods, where the network of blood vessels creates a continuous supply of oxygen to all parts of the body. One way to make the system more efficient is to have a muscle or pump to ensure a constant flow of oxygen-rich blood over the organs, and of oxygen-depleted blood back to the gill surface. Perhaps our bilaterian has a series of muscular rings around the hemocoel, like a collection of primitive hearts, which will give the animal an efficient means of powering its metabolism. So that takes care of oxygen, but this creature will also need a means of acquiring food. Since this is a motile animal, it will be able to move to new areas to actively seek out food, allowing it to potentially adopt a predatory lifestyle. So it will need a mouth to consume prey and a digestive tract to allow the nutrients from the ingested food to diffuse into the blood and be transported around the body. Now, since we're dealing with an active motile animal, and because it's bilaterally symmetrical, that necessarily means that the creature has a front and a back end. This pretty much inevitably leads to another very common evolutionary trend, cephalization, the clustering together of the nervous system into a head of sorts, which frequently co-occurs with the sensory organs and the mouth. While cephalization does occur to a limited degree among radial body plans, it tends to be a lot more pronounced in bilateral creatures, for the simple reason that it helps to have the sensory organs arranged so that you can see what's in front of you, and to have a mouth near the sensory organs to make it easier to eat things, and so that you can sense the food before it's ingested. So first off, we're going to need to give our creature some form of sensory organ, in particular, eyes. Somewhat surprisingly, eyes seem to evolve quite easily, as evidenced by the fact that they've arisen independently many times across hugely disparate lineages, with even some microbes and seaweeds being able to sense light to some degree. What begins as a patch of light-sensitive cells may then form into a sort of cup that allows the animal to better sense the direction that light is coming from, and then a lens may evolve to focus the light directly onto the retina to resolve a clear image. Most often, animals will have at least 2 eyes, since having multiple eyes allows for increased depth perception. This can range from the only 2 eyes of vertebrates, to the 3 to 8 eyes of arthropods, to the 24 eyes of the box jellyfish, to the over 100 eyes of scallops. We'll give our bilaterian an array of 6 simple eyes surrounding the mouth, giving it a full view of what's in front of it. And once it has the ability to see, the animal will need a way of processing the sensory information. While nerves run the full length of the body, perhaps a ganglion or nerve cluster evolves near the eyes, like a primitive brain, and so now we have something like a head taking shape. Meanwhile, in radially symmetrical body plans, cephalization may involve grouping the nervous system around the center of mass, like the nerve net of a jellyfish or the nerve ring of a starfish. A sessile organism doesn't have very many intellectually demanding tasks to attend to, so it can afford to have a comparatively simple nervous system. However, if our radial creatures are feeding using a large, delicate membrane, that makes them very vulnerable to predators, so they may benefit from an early warning system. Perhaps they have vibration-sensitive cells or even simple eyes near the tips of their feeding appendages that allow them to detect incoming predators. But having the ability to sense predators does little good if there's no way to respond to it. Since swimming away isn't an option, many sessile animals have some form of armor for protection. On Earth, the shells of these marine creatures are usually calcareous, most often calcium carbonate, but here we have the opportunity to do something a little bit different. Remember that we've got an atmosphere rich in hydrogen sulfide, which dissolves in water, and we've got chemosynthetic microbes that convert atmospheric hydrogen sulfide into elemental sulfur. This means that there's an enormous amount of free sulfur available, so maybe the marine organisms can evolve to take up the sulfur to form hard shells made out of calcium sulfate. So our radial body plan can have a protective shell into which it can retract its feeding arms. Motile animals, on the other hand, have the advantage of swimming away to avoid predators, so our bilateral body plan may forego armor completely and instead invest purely in speed. Now, both of our body plans have a means of respiration, feeding, and defense, but there's still one last essential detail to figure out: reproduction. The most basic means of reproduction is asexual reproduction, where an organism reproduces by essentially cloning itself, creating offspring that are, for all intents and purposes, genetically identical to the parent. Since doing this doesn't require a mate, the organism isn't limited in its spawning and can reproduce whenever it wants, allowing populations to multiply very quickly. However, despite these advantages, asexual reproduction isn't actually as common as you might think. There appears to be a strong evolutionary pressure across just about every branch of the Tree of Life to maximize genetic diversity, which allows for beneficial genes to spread quickly through populations and accelerates the rate of adaptation. Because of this, sexual reproduction has become the most common reproductive strategy across virtually every lineage of multicellular life. Even many kinds of bacteria have some mechanism for exchanging genes. Sexual reproduction most often involves a distinction between male and female sexes, but there's a huge number of possible variants on this system, and we'll discuss those at a later date. For now, let's say that both our radial and our bilateral body plans have individuals that are either male or female. When it comes to sexual reproduction, sessile organisms face a problem. How do you find a mate if you can't move? The most common solution to this is what's called broadcast spawning, where the animals release an enormous quantity of gametes, or sex cells, into the water. Only a tiny fraction of male and female cells will meet and develop into larvae, and only a small portion of those larvae will survive to adulthood. This is a very inefficient strategy, but it's one of the only reliable ways for sessile organisms to ensure a high degree of dispersal. Often, the larvae of these sessile creatures evolve adaptations to help them cope with this first incredibly vulnerable period of their life cycle. For our radial creatures, before the larvae have grown to the point where they can attach themselves to the seabed and develop their protective armor, they'll need to rely on some other defense mechanism. Perhaps they can adapt their underdeveloped feeding arms into appendages they can beat back and forth for locomotion, allowing them some degree of motility to escape predators and find a suitable spot to metamorphose into adults. For our bilateral creature, being motile allows it to actively search for a mate, which massively increases the chances of a successful fertilization. Let's give it a gonopore, or gland that produces gametes, on its final segment. And there we have it, 2 basic body plans. Depending on how detailed your project is, a full biosphere will have anywhere from half a dozen to over 100 body plans, but for this series we'll just focus on these 2. I'm going to dub the radial phylum Anthostoma, and the bilateral one Polypodia. Note that I'm using standard Greek and Latin based nomenclature, but feel free to use whatever naming schema makes sense for your project. Now, these body plans may not seem all that different from some of the ones that exist on Earth, but I've done this intentionally to demonstrate why certain real-world body plans have evolved the way they have. For your own project, feel free to run wild with ideas and create whatever off-the-wall body plans you can come up with, as long as they have a justifiable means of respiration, feeding, defense, and reproduction. However, remember that these body plans are just basic ancestral blueprints, and as they evolve over the next few 100 million years, they may become completely unrecognizable from these primitive forebears. In the next episode, we'll see how the descendants of these ancient creatures diversify into a whole menagerie of different forms. In the last episode, we covered the first 4 billion years of our alien planet's history, including the evolution of complex multicellular life and the resultant explosion of biodiversity from which emerged 2 body plans. As of yet, these body plans only serve as theoretical blueprints, but with the passing of millions of years, the various descendants of these ancestral forms may undergo heavy modification as they diversify into separate lineages, or clades. A clade is a group of species that share a common ancestor, represented by a single branch of the Tree of Life along with any and all branches that stem from it. For example, snakes form a clade of reptiles, but also form part of a larger clade along with lizards, a group known as the squamates. And in turn, squamates can be grouped together with tuataras under the even larger clade Lepidosauria. However, lepidosaurs and turtles do not form a single clade because not all the descendants of the last common ancestor are included. This visual representation of the relatedness of different clades is called a cladogram, or phylogenetic tree. The next step in creating our alien biosphere is to construct some cladograms for our 2 body plans, and to do that, we need to have them undergo diversification into different clades. This diversification is likely to be driven by adaptation to different modes of life, or, more specifically, to different niches. An ecological niche is essentially the role a given species plays in its ecosystem. The precise definition is multifaceted and may take into account the species' habitat, feeding, reproduction, and its relationship to other species. Clades will often specialize for a group of related niches, such as how the big cats have occupied the niches of large predators. However, a single niche cannot be occupied by more than one species within any given ecosystem, or else the two species will be in direct competition, which would ultimately lead to one of them going extinct. This will be important to bear in mind later on, but for now, we first need to identify the niches present in our ancient sea and see how our body plans can evolve to exploit them. To start with, the vast majority of energy input in almost all ecosystems will come from sunlight, which in our ancient oceans will power the metabolisms of billions of photosynthetic microbes. Specifically on this alien planet, though, there is another source of energy in the form of atmospheric hydrogen sulfide, which, although it's been gradually depleted over the past few billion years, still provides energy for rafts of chemosynthetic microbes that float on the water's surface. Together, these autotrophs will form huge clouds of plankton in the surface waters, serving as a virtually inexhaustible source of food, and thus the basis of the food chain for the majority of oceanic ecosystems. The term plankton refers to any organism incapable of swimming against the current, including these single-celled autotrophs, or phytoplankton, as well as a host of tiny animals, or zooplankton, that feed on them. One group of animals that's very likely to form a large component of the zooplankton are the anthostome larvae, whom we've already said live near the surface before descending to the seabed to complete their metamorphosis. These larvae will likely feed in a similar way to the adults, using their feeding arms to catch food particles. While they are capable of controlling their position in the water to a small degree by waving their feeding arms, the larvae aren't able to move independently of the currents and so still get classed as plankton. The polypods may have some representatives among the zooplankton as well. One major advantage the polypods have when it comes to adapting their body structure is their segmentation, as individual segments can be specialized to perform specific functions, allowing for increased body complexity. This can be seen in many clades of arthropods, annelids, and even vertebrates, which, although missing any external signs of segmentation, show a pattern during embryonic development of tissues arranged in repeating units, which then differentiate to form various aspects of the body structure in much the same way as other segmented body plans. One way this specialization of segments may manifest is through tagmosis, the fusion of multiple segments into a single morphological unit, or tagma. On Earth, many groups of arthropod have independently undergone tagmosis to organize their body into different regions for a specialized function. One very likely development is for some of the anterior segments to unite into a tagma dedicated to feeding. If we say these polypods undergo tagmosis of the first two segments, then the limbs on these segments could specialize into appendages for handling food. Further tagmosis may fuse the third, fourth, and fifth segments together into a tagma dedicated to propulsion. The limbs may broaden and develop elongated bristles, or setae, to enlarge their surface area. Spasmodically beating these limbs provides short bursts of jerky movement, reminiscent of the antenna-driven swimming of Daphnia or Cyclops. The segments posterior to the locomotive tagma, no longer being needed for propulsion, may evolve to form an enlarged gill surface and to house the internal organs. In particular, their reproductive systems may adapt to increase fecundity, the number of offspring an individual is capable of producing. Plankton tend to have very high reproductive rates, as their only real defense against predators is sheer numbers. These tiny polypods may live much like copepods on Earth, comprising thousands of species and forming a large proportion of the biomass in the ancient seas. I'll call this clade of polypods Tachypodia. The tachypods and the anthostome larvae may serve as prey for larger zooplankton. While most anthostomes are filter feeders, there may be room for them to expand into other methods of feeding. Perhaps rather than passively straining the water for plankton, they can adapt their feeding arms into tentacles for catching larger prey. To increase their feeding surface, they may evolve a body cavity, like a stomach, which will make their feeding much more efficient. I'll call this innovative new clade of anthostomes the gastrozoans. The larvae of these gastrozoans will develop a stomach as they mature, allowing them to feed on zooplankton such as the tachypods. While still classified as plankton due to their inability to swim against the current, the gastrozoan larvae may grow quite large before their metamorphosis, possibly living in a similar way to jellyfish, drifting through the water and ensnaring passing prey with their tentacles. All of these various planktonic clades form an abundant food source for larger nectonic clades. Unlike plankton at the mercy of the ocean currents, nekton are species capable of independent movement thanks to adaptations that enable efficient swimming. The ancestral polypod accomplished this with back and forth strokes of the many limbs that lined its body, but this is by no means the only option for effective aquatic locomotion. By undulating from side to side, the whole length of the body can be used to exert force on the surrounding water. This is called anguilliform swimming, and is used by many clades of fish, as well as aquatic reptiles and polychaete worms. If a clade of polypod evolved this form of swimming, it would grant them much greater speed than the limb-driven swimming of their ancestors, allowing them to diversify into the niches of large, active predators. This clade may be descended from the same stock as the tachypods, and so inherit the same feeding tagma consisting of the first two segments. In these creatures, the feeding arms may become grasping tentacles lined with setae, which may be adapted into sharp spines for catching and impaling large prey, or into long baleen-like bristles to filter plankton. Since thrust is provided by the lateral motion of the body, the limbs are no longer needed for propulsion, and so the anterior limbs may now serve as stabilizing fins to support the body and maintain depth, while the posterior limbs may become completely vestigial and thus shrink to reduce drag. And as this clade further specializes for fast swimming, the final segment may evolve a fin to increase the volume of water displaced by the tail's movement, and therefore provide greater leverage against the water, allowing for the evolution of more specialized forms of swimming, such as chorangiform or thunniform swimming, in which the central mass of the body is kept mostly stationary, while the propulsive force is provided solely by the movement of the finned tail. With this design, this clade is well equipped for predatory niches, including shark-like pursuit hunters and whale-like filter feeders. Let's call these creatures acanthopods. Meanwhile, anthostomes aren't anywhere near as mobile as polypods, even in their larval form, so they may be excluded from such predatory niches in open ocean or pelagic environments, but they may have more luck in benthic environments on the seabed. Here, nutrients filter down from the surface waters in what's called marine snow, which constitutes the main food source in the lower layers of the water column. The majority of marine snow will be taken up by benthic filter feeders like the adult anthostomes, while the remainder collects on the ocean floor, forming a layer of detritus that serves as food for other benthic creatures. This creates a niche that may be occupied by another clade of polypods. Let's say this clade splits off from the main line before the tagmosis of the first two segments, and thus represents a sister clade to all other polypods we've discussed so far. Tagmosis will be a useful innovation in this clade as well, perhaps this time involving the fusion of the first four segments into a feeding tagma. The first, second, and third pair of limbs may form a frond of tentacles for filtering and handling food, while the fourth pair may be designed for burrowing or digging through the sediment for organic detritus. These limbs may bear setae like the other polypodian clades to help them sift through the sand, but may also be used as a means of sensing vibrations in the water, giving them a way of detecting incoming predators. The remaining five segments may form a second tagma dedicated to locomotion. The gills on all of these segments may fuse into a single surface on the creature's underside, and the fifth pair of limbs may evolve into specialized fins that beat back and forth to pass water over the gill surface to increase oxygen intake, much like the pleopods of some crustaceans on Earth. The sixth, seventh, and eighth pair of limbs comprise the primary locomotor limbs. What were once fins used for swimming may now be adapted into rudimentary legs for crawling over or burrowing through the substrate. While the ancestral polypod had limbs made of simple muscle, these benthic polypods may require something more robust to support their bodies and give them leverage to dig through the sediment. The limbs of the ancestral polypod likely evolved from extensions of the gill surface, and so the base of the limb may occur very close to the hemocoel, since oxygen needs to be able to diffuse through the gills directly into the blood. Perhaps in this clade, an offshoot of the hemocoel could extend into the limbs, which would provide them with more oxygen and also help maintain their structure through hydrostatic pressure. A muscular valve around the base of the limb may allow this outgrowth of the hemocoel to be successively inflated and deflated with blood, which, in conjunction with movements of the leg muscles, will allow the limb to function as a sort of hydraulic piston. This mechanism is also used by starfish on Earth, which have a complex water vascular system that pumps fluid into and out of the tube feed to move them along the seabed. The final pair of limbs, however, may lose their locomotive function and instead be developed into gonopods, limbs specialized to aid in reproduction, in this case allowing these polypods to lock their bodies together during spawning and to facilitate the transfer of gametes. This clade will live much like crabs and lobsters, sifting through the detritus for organic matter. I'll call these creatures sarcopods. In the deeper layers of the sea, they'll be safe from most pelagic predators such as the acanthopods, but the benthic environment will come with its own predators. We've said that the gastrozoans have evolved a gut and the ability to ingest prey, and this capability extends into their developing larvae. Perhaps this reaches its pinnacle with one final innovation. Neoteny occurs when traits associated with the larval or juvenile stage of a species are maintained into adulthood. Sometimes this may manifest as a species losing the ability to metamorphose into adults, completing their entire life cycle in the larval form. If this happens in a clade of gastrozoans, then instead of attaching to the substrate and becoming sessile upon reaching maturity, they may evolve to remain motile throughout their whole lives. Freed from the constraints of a sessile existence, this clade of gastrozoans may now specialize for active predation, which may entail some severe changes to their body structure. As we touched on last time, among animals on Earth there is a strong correlation between motility and bilateral symmetry. It could be that bilaterally symmetrical animals are predisposed to motile niches, and thus occupied them before radial creatures had the chance to adapt to them, but there are some examples of motile animals with bilateral symmetry that evolved from radially symmetrical ancestors, as can be seen in one of the most criminally underrated animals on Earth, the sea pig. These are a clade of sea cucumbers that have evolved a motile lifestyle to help them forage across wide areas of the ocean floor. Sea pigs belong to the phylum Echinodermata, the same phylum as starfish, which means the sea pig's ancestors exhibited radial symmetry, but as they evolved to become more motile, they secondarily evolved bilateral symmetry. This provides some evidence that bilateral symmetry will be favoured in motile animals, even if they descend from a radial ancestor, so the same thing may occur in our neotenous gastrozoans. When they first evolve lifelong motility, they may propel themselves with wafts of their tentacles, or by dragging their bodies along the seafloor like octopuses or brittle stars. Eventually, cephalization may kick in and a single direction of movement may develop, around which a plane of symmetry may form. As discussed last time, it's likely the mouth will form the front end of the animal for efficient feeding, and consequently the arms surrounding the mouth will move forward as well. In the ancestral anthostomes, these arms serve many purposes, including respiration, feeding, and sensing the environment. Upon evolving bilateral symmetry, these limbs may become individually specialized for specific functions. Some of the limbs may become sensory stalks that let the animal detect and zero in on prey, equipped with eyes and a series of vibration-sensitive setae. These organs are especially delicate and would pose a huge threat to the animal's survival if lost or damaged, so the ancestral condition of being able to retract these limbs may come in handy, in much the same way that snails are capable of retracting their eye stalks. Other limbs may become specialized gills with an enlarged surface area to increase oxygen uptake. Like in the polypods, these gills may contain an extension of a hemocoel, and muscular contractions within the base of the limbs may pump blood between the gills and the rest of the body. Meanwhile, still other limbs may become feeding arms to force prey into the muscular mouth. These limbs may evolve sharp hooks or teeth to help grip prey and masticate it before ingestion. Note that because their digestive system evolved from a single cavity formed from the feeding surface, these creatures won't have a through gut like the polypods, where food is ingested at one end of the animal and waste is expelled at the other. Instead, food is digested in the stomach and then waste is regurgitated back out of the mouth, similar to some flatworms and jellyfish on Earth. The remaining limbs may be used for locomotion, beginning as simple tentacles that drag the creature along the seabed, but then eventually evolving into more efficient feet, flippers. While they never become fully sessile, they may still develop the same mineralized armor that the adults do, still serving as defense against larger predators. However, this armor will still at least partially restrict their movement, so they'll likely be outcompeted for the niches of pelagic predators by the acanthopods. But they'll thrive in deeper waters, feeding on the sarcopods or other benthic animals living among the detritus. But the evolution of motility provides these anthostomes with another advantage. Recall the sessile anthostomes are committed to broadcast spawning, meaning they produce vast quantities of gametes, only a very small percentage of which are fertilized and survive to adulthood. By developing motility, the neotenous anthostomes are now able to actively search for a mate, minimizing the distance the gametes need to travel and thus substantially increasing the chances of a successful fertilization. The ancestral anthostome would have produced gametes from internal gonads and then expelled them into the water through gonopores at the base of the feeding arms. However, in the gastrozoans, as the stomach evolved, these gonopores may have migrated inside the body cavity, meaning that the gastrozoans, including these new neotenous forms, will produce gametes from a gland on the inside of their mouth, which means that they eat, expel waste, and secrete sex cells all out of the same hole. Yeah, nature can be gross sometimes. And one final note on reproduction. Most anthostomes only develop a reproductive system during their metamorphosis into adults. This means that before they mature, the larvae are neither male nor female, completely lacking any sexual characteristics. Then, once they metamorphose, they become either male or female, perhaps based on certain environmental cues such as temperature or the availability of certain nutrients, rather like the developing embryos of crocodilians. But since these neotenous anthostomes never undergo metamorphosis, they will instead gradually develop a reproductive system once they reach maturity, with the same delayed onset sex determination as the other anthostomes. With this suite of bizarre traits, I'm going to dub these bilateral gastrozoans tentaclostomes. And with that, we've got a pretty solid outline for the ecosystem of our ancient oceans, and a fairly extensive cladogram for both of our body plans. Keep in mind, of course, that evolution on this scale takes millions of generations, and for every clade we've developed, there are likely to be innumerable intermediary forms, as well as many other clades that have either gone extinct or simply aren't included for clarity. This will represent our ancient ocean's ecosystem for the first 100 million years or so following the emergence of the two body plans. However, while the oceans are brimming with life, there's still one habitat yet to be colonized. In the next episode, we'll see how the descendants of these marine creatures haul themselves out of the sea and take up residence on dry land.
Mission accomplished.
結果さえ伴うならちょっと苦労するのも悪くないね。出発するよ。隠密行動を心がけてね。
Last time, our two ancestral body plans diversified into different clades to fill the niches of the ancient oceans. But now, 100 million years after the body plans first appeared, the stage is at last set for their descendants to emerge from the sea and take the first steps onto dry land. So far, all life on our alien planet has been restricted to the water, and for good reason. At this point in history, dry land represents an extreme habitat and poses a huge challenge to potential colonists. If an animal comes out onto land, there will obviously be no water to swim through, and so it will be unable to support itself and so collapse and die. Not only that, but outside of the ocean, any water in the animal's body will quickly evaporate through its skin, and so the animal will dehydrate, desiccate, and die. Not to mention the fact that, as of yet, there's no food outside the ocean, so any animal that comes onto the land will starve and die. So dry land seems like a pretty inhospitable place, and yet, on Earth, it's been colonized innumerable times by a huge diversity of different clades. The most obvious examples being the forerunners of tetrapods and terrestrial arthropods that came onto land hundreds of millions of years ago, but also including more recent examples like mudskippers, air-breathing catfish, and terrestrial sea slugs. So why have all of these different groups come onto land despite the numerous difficulties involved? The simple answer is a lack of competition. The oceanic ecosystems are already thoroughly colonized, so the marine species must compete furiously to obtain food and avoid predators. But if a species comes onto land, especially at such an early stage in the history of multicellular life, there'll be no other species to compete with and no predators to worry about. So selective pressures will pretty much inevitably drive organisms to come ashore. However, going from wholly aquatic to totally terrestrial would be a very drastic change in lifestyle, but fortunately, the transition doesn't have to be so immediate. The intertidal zone, sometimes called the littoral zone, forms a perfect medium between land and water. Organisms living in this zone will become exposed as the tide ebbs, and so will benefit from adaptations that allow them to survive until the tide returns. Over many generations, individuals that are able to survive out of the water for longer will enjoy less competition, and will thus be selected for, until they're ultimately able to live entirely on land. Luckily for our alien life forms, their planet's large moon means that the high tide will be almost 3 times higher than Earth's, creating a large intertidal zone that will allow for a very gradual transition to terrestrial life. However, there's still no reason to go further than the high water mark if there's no food outside the sea. While this will halt the progress of the animals, it won't be a problem for the autotrophs, who can produce their own food, so they'll be the first organisms to make the jump to a permanently land-dwelling existence. On Earth, terrestrial autotrophs consist almost exclusively of phototrophs, most notably the plants, but on our alien planet, we also have chemotrophs that gain energy from oxidizing hydrogen sulfide. Up until now, we've assumed that these autotrophs have remained relatively simple and unspecialized, mostly existing as plankton or other basal organisms. But over the past few 100 million years, as the animals have been diversifying, the autotrophs will have been evolving as well. Perhaps one kingdom of chemotrophs evolves to cluster together to form colonies and ultimately become full-fledged multicellular life forms. Since hydrogen sulfide dissolves in water, these organisms can only carry out chemosynthesis when they're in contact with the atmosphere, and so they may form large rafts or mats that float on the ocean's surface. If some of these rafts specialize to live in the intertidal zone, they'll be out of reach of many pelagic predators such as the large filter-feeding acanthopods. At low tide, they'll be exposed to the atmosphere, allowing them to take in hydrogen sulfide, and at high tide, they'll take in water to stave off dehydration. As they evolve to become increasingly terrestrial, their outer membranes will thicken to better retain water. However, making the membrane waterproof will also make it harder for hydrogen sulfide to pass through it, so these organisms may evolve specialized pores or stomata that can be opened to take in hydrogen sulfide and closed to prevent water loss. These stomata may connect to a layer of vascular tissue that transports the hydrogen sulfide to every cell in the organism. Also, recall that these organisms produce elemental sulfur as a byproduct of their chemosynthesis, so these stomata may secrete excess sulfur to prevent it from building up in their tissues. This means a coating of sulfur will gradually accumulate on their cuticles, which will get washed away as the tide comes in. When it comes to reproduction, these chemotrophs will need to tackle the usual problems faced by sessile organisms. Their colonial ancestors may have reproduced asexually, perhaps by budding or fragmentation. If the terrestrial forms inherit this mode of reproduction, they'll be able to colonize unsettled areas of the shorelines very quickly. But at higher population densities, they may be incentivized to switch to sexual reproduction to increase genetic diversity and give them an edge over the competition. In such a case, they may grow gametangia, specialized organs that produce gametes, which are then released into the air in huge quantities, very similar to the broadcast spawning used by sessile marine creatures like the anthrostomes. However, while in the water, gametes can drift among the currents more or less indefinitely, and so will have a considerable span of time to encounter other gametes, on land, without the density of water to keep them buoyant, the gametes won't remain airborne for long, and once they reach the ground, they'll die very quickly. One way of alleviating this problem is to have fertilization take place within the gametangium itself. The male gametes are released immediately, while the female gametes are withheld until a male gamete lands on the gametangium. The two gametes then merge to form a spore, which is then dispersed and can immediately begin growing into a new organism once it lands. These will be some of the first ever terrestrial life forms, forming sulfur-coated carpets of lichen-like crust growing over the rocks and sand. But as they begin to populate the coastlines, they'll pave the way for other colonists. Like the chemotrophs, the phototrophs will need to access the atmosphere in order to take in carbon dioxide, which dissolves in water, and so they'll mostly live near the water's surface. These organisms, though, gain energy from chemical reactions that occur between sunlight and the photosynthetic pigments in their cells. Among phototrophs on Earth, the dominant plant kingdom and the related clades of green algae use chlorophyll for photosynthesis, giving them their characteristic green color, while other clades of algae make use of a multitude of other pigments, each one gaining energy from a different portion of the spectrum of light produced by the sun. Our alien planet star is a class GV star, just like Earth's sun, so it will produce a similar spectrum, meaning the various kingdoms of phototrophs will show a similar variety of pigments to those on Earth. Let's say there's a class of algae on this planet that uses a red pigment for photosynthesis, and that one clade of these algae specializes for life in the intertidal zone. Once again, any individuals that are left exposed at low tide are at risk of desiccating, but instead of evolving their own mechanisms to resist dehydration, they may simply take advantage of the abundant colonies of chemotrophs that already cover the shore. By incorporating themselves inside the membranes of the chemotrophs, the algae can rely on their host's toughened cuticles to protect them from desiccation. This will also provide them with extra nutrients, as they can take up the sulfur and water given off as waste products by the chemotroph. Since they now rely on the chemotroph for nutrients and shelter, it's in the algae's best interests to make sure that their host stays alive and healthy, so they may evolve to provide the chemotroph with a portion of the glucose they produce from photosynthesis, which is more chemically efficient than the formaldehyde that the chemotrophs produce. This sort of symbiosis between phototrophs and other organisms happens often in evolution. Corals rely on photosynthetic zooxanthellae to provide them with sugars in return for minerals and carbon dioxide. Lichens consist of a photosynthetic alga that shares the sugar it produces with the fungus that shelters it, and about 80% of all plant species have fungal or bacterial symbiotes in their root systems to aid in nitrogen fixation and acquiring minerals from the soil. However, this partnership poses a difficulty when it comes to reproduction. Whenever the chemophyte reproduces, it will need to ensure some of its algal symbiotes are transferred to its offspring, so when it grows a female gametangium, some algae may migrate inside and attach themselves to the gametes. When a male gamete lands within the gametangium and fertilizes the female gamete, the algae will be released with the spore as part of a pre-packaged dispersal unit, or diaspore. And once the diaspore lands and the new plant begins growing, the algae will multiply asexually to fill the chemotroph's tissues. I'm going to dub these symbiotic organisms chemophytes, although for simplicity I'll be referring to them informally as plants from now on, even though technically they're not plants in the strictest sense. The carbon dioxide these plants need for photosynthesis will be supplied by the respiration of animals and aerobic microorganisms, while the hydrogen sulfide for chemosynthesis is given off by organic decomposition and by sulfur-reducing microbes. As these plants proliferate, they'll cause the atmospheric proportions of these gases to steadily decline, and oxygen levels to rise. Once they become fully terrestrial, they may increase their structural complexity. To take up as much sunlight, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide as possible, they'll benefit from a large surface area, which, once again, in accordance with the square cube law, will favour a thin, flat shape, which is part of the reason why the leaves of plants on Earth are shaped the way they are. However, large leaves will also have a high air resistance, increasing their likelihood of being damaged by the wind. This can be mitigated by having spaces within or between the leaves for wind to pass through, which may take the form of a branching structure. For maximum exposure to sunlight, they may evolve stems or stalks that grow upwards towards the sun. The tallest plants will have the best access to light, and so an arms race will then ensue, with plants growing taller and taller, eventually evolving into forms that might be called trees. Since there are no terrestrial herbivores as of yet, these trees may spread uninhibited across the landscape, forming vast forests of uninterrupted greenery. Or perhaps reddery, I suppose? And as the plants establish themselves on land, they'll present a new food source that may coax the animals into taking their first steps out of water. The sessile anthostomes rely on the ocean currents to bring them food, meaning they can't feed above the waterline, so the land won't have very much to offer them. But the motile tentaclostomes stand much more to gain from making landfall. Perhaps some tentaclostome species come into the intertidal zone to spawn, as the shallows and tide pools form an ideal shelter for their developing larvae. These coastal species may evolve to supplement their diet by feeding on the chemophytes along the shore, and eventually be enticed out of the intertidal zone by the abundance of food offered by the land plants. Initially, they'll need to constantly return to the water to prevent desiccation. In particular, their gills are especially vulnerable to drying out. While in the water, a large surface area allowed increased oxygen uptake, on land it means a greater area for water to evaporate through, so having a large breathing surface is now a detriment. Recall though that the tentaclostomes are capable of retracting their limbs, so the gills may be withdrawn into the body when not in use, minimizing their exposure to the air and preventing water loss. And as the tentaclostomes become increasingly terrestrial, perhaps their gills evolve to become permanently retracted into pockets within the body, somewhat like a pair of lungs. Air passes into these lungs through spiracles or pneumostomes on the creature's sides, and the muscles at the base of the lungs may become a pair of hearts to pump the oxygenated blood around the body. Since this passive form of breathing relies on a constant flow of oxygen-rich air into the lungs, the energy they get from respiration will be directly proportional to the levels of atmospheric oxygen. The less oxygen available, the less energy they'll have to maintain their growth, and so will have an upper limit on the size they can reach before their volume becomes too large to sustain. This is one reason why terrestrial arthropods on Earth don't get larger than a few kilograms at the most, as they rely on a similar mechanism of passive respiration. Luckily though, the proliferation of the land plants will steadily oxygenate the atmosphere, allowing these tentaclostomes to attain fairly large sizes. However, their maximum size will still be limited by their lack of internal support structures. To help them locomote on land, their fins may lose their hydrodynamic specializations and evolve into simple feet made of pure muscle. This is very inefficient and energetically demanding, as the muscles will need to be tensed continuously to keep the body supported. Beyond a certain weight, this becomes impractical, posing another limit on their potential size. Although recall this planet's gravity is 20% lower than Earth's, so this constraint won't be quite as severe as it would be for animals on Earth. The only structural support the tentaclostomes have is their shell. The shells of marine anthostomes are made of calcium sulfate, which they form by taking in minerals dissolved in the seawater. However, there's obviously no dissolved minerals in air, so forming a calcium sulfate shell on land may be infeasible. On Earth, the various groups of arthropods have independently invaded land numerous times, and in almost every instance have lost the mineral component of their shells, forsaking the ancestral calcium carbonate shell for one primarily formed of chitin. Our terrestrial tentaclostomes may do the same, turning their mineralized shell into a lighter, more flexible substance. Since the shell is impermeable to water, it helps prevent desiccation, which may also be averted by evolving a thick, waterproof skin, allowing them to venture out of the water indefinitely. However, they'll still be tied to the water for reproduction. Just as with the chemophytes, the tentaclostomes' gametes and larvae are prone to desiccation on land, so the tentaclostomes will need to return to the water to spawn, and their larvae will need to remain in the water until they develop the waterproof skin and air-breathing capabilities of the adults. To become totally independent of the water and colonize drier habitats, the terrestrial tentaclostomes will need to evolve internal fertilization. With this reproductive innovation, instead of the male and female expelling gametes into the water and having the larvae develop on their own, the male will transfer his gametes into the female's body through what's called a cloacal kiss. The female will then contain the fertilized eggs within an oviduct, where they'll develop a waterproof outer casing that allows them to be laid on land without desiccating. This will also dramatically increase reproductive efficiency, as while within the oviduct, the eggs will be protected from predation and adverse conditions until they reach a suitable stage of development. Note that this strategy closely mirrors the reproductive adaptations of the terrestrial chemophytes, which similarly carry out fertilization within the relative safety of the female gametangium. No longer reliant on the water to reproduce, these tentaclostomes may now push inland, undergoing further specializations for their new terrestrial habitats along the way. To cope with a varied diet, the setae on their feeding arms may evolve into rasping surfaces, like the radulae of gastropods, while their stomach may develop a branching structure to increase surface area, as well as a number of ceca, or pouches to store digested food, which when full will then evert back into the stomach so waste can be regurgitated. These tentaclostomes will be the first true land animals, and are set to spread across the continent to occupy the abundant niches of the new terrestrial ecosystems. I'll call these creatures lophostomes. But though they may have won the race to land, they'll shortly be followed by other colonists. Among the polypods, the planktonic tachypods rely on the ocean currents for movement, so they may not fare well out of water, and the acanthopods are very specialized for aquatic life. But the sarcopods may be adaptable enough to make the transition to a terrestrial existence. By this point, the chemophytes may grow into large coastal swamps around the mouths of rivers and estuaries, where the sarcopods might come to spawn or scavenge. As they evolve to inhabit shallower waters, their eyes might move towards their dorsal surface to allow them to see above the waterline, a common condition found in many semi-aquatic animals. Vertebrates on Earth have only 2 eyes, which provide a fairly narrow range of vision regardless of how they're positioned. This may have contributed to the evolution of the neck, which allows for the head and the eyes attached to it to be aimed in different directions to take in visual information over a wider range. Having a neck also allows for the mouth to be brought closer to food without moving the entire body, which conserves energy and makes feeding easier. The sarcopods, on the other hand, have 6 eyes that grant a much greater field of vision without needing to be repositioned, and they have anterior limbs that can be used to reach for food and pass it into the mouth, so evolving a neck may not be necessary. Instead of having a head distinct from the body, the sarcopods will have a somewhat head-like anterior tagma, or cephalothorax, and a posterior tagma, or abdomen. In these tidal swamps, coming onto land will present more opportunities for scavenging and predation, so some species of sarcopods may adopt an amphibious lifestyle. To stay out of water for longer, the sarcopods will need to solve the same problems as the lophostomes, and so may converge on similar solutions, developing a tough waterproof integument and adapting their respiratory system for air breathing. Just like with the lophostomes, the sarcopod's large ventral gill surface will lose water very quickly when exposed to air, and so is likely to be internalized to prevent dehydration, forming a lung-like chamber. Unlike the lophostomes, however, the sarcopods may evolve a mechanism for actively pumping air into and out of this lung to increase respiratory efficiency. The aquatic sarcopods use the constant beating of their 5th pair of limbs, or pleopods, to continuously pass water over the gills for greater oxygen uptake. But in the terrestrial sarcopods, these limbs may also become internalized, where they may atrophy into a set of muscles that allow them to actively inhale and exhale, somewhat analogous to the diaphragm of Earth's vertebrates. This mechanism is much more efficient than simply letting the oxygen diffuse into the lung as the lophostomes do, and so provides the body with extra energy, meaning the size constraint posed by the atmospheric oxygen levels won't be anywhere near as limiting. For full terrestrialization, they may also evolve internal fertilization like the lophostomes, with the gonopods assisting in the transfer of gametes from the male to the female. But instead of laying batches of eggs that are each individually protected by an outer shell, perhaps the female sarcopod protects the fertilized eggs from desiccation by containing them within a leathery sac formed from the lining of her oviduct. This egg sac, or ootheca, may contain dozens of developing young, and will serve as their first meal upon hatching. With these developments, the sarcopods are now able to leave the water behind for good and specialize for life on land. The sarcopods are, in a sense, already pre-adapted to terrestrial locomotion thanks to their hydrostatic skeleton, which lends their body a degree of support. However, beyond a certain size, hydrostatic pressure alone won't be enough to keep them from collapsing, and the legs will buckle under the increased weight. One way of dealing with this is to stiffen the limb by evolving permanently inflexible components, so that the limb won't deform as easily and therefore won't need as much muscle power to maintain rigidity. This may begin as filaments of stiffened muscle fibers within the walking legs, which will include the limbs evolved from the 4th, 6th, 7th, and 8th segments. These fibers may then become reinforced with layers of a hardened polymer, becoming a structure similar to the bones of Earth's vertebrates, although having evolved along very different lines. The legs will have several joints to allow them to articulate, while longitudinal muscles around the margins of the hemocoel may ossify to form a limb girdle to which the leg muscles will be anchored. Once the capability to produce this bone-like polymer has evolved, it may get co-opted for other purposes, namely protecting the internal organs. Arguably, the most important part of the body to protect is the brain and the sensory organs, so it's likely a brain case or skull plate may evolve, along with other deposits of bone around the cephalothorax, as well as along the lateral nerve cords that serve as the equivalent of the spinal cord. This skeleton, as well as their efficient respiratory systems, will allow these sarcopods to grow to considerable sizes. By the time the sarcopods come onto land, the lophostomes will have already occupied the majority of the available niches, but the sarcopod's size advantage will give them access to megafaunal niches that the lophostomes are excluded from. To further specialize for attaining large sizes, they'll need to evolve a more efficient cardiovascular system, as extra weight puts more pressure on circulation. The hemocoel used to function as both the hydrostatic skeleton and the circulatory system, but now that the role of structural support is taken up by a true endoskeleton, the hemocoel can now evolve into a closed circulatory system, in which blood is moved continuously through a series of vessels to ensure a constant flow of oxygen to every cell in the body. The ancestral polypod pumped blood through the hemocoel by contracting rings of muscle within each of its segments, but as these terrestrial sarcopods grow larger, the contractive muscles within the abdomen may fuse into a single dedicated heart. The new circulatory system will also need to have a filtering mechanism to prevent the buildup of metabolic waste products and toxins in the blood. Each of the segments of the ancestral polypod may have had a pair of nephridia, or glands involved in blood filtration, which may survive in these terrestrial forms as a series of kidney-like organs within the abdomen. Their digestive system may also undergo some changes as well. The simple gastrointestinal tract of the ancestral polypod may develop a foregut or gizzard within the cephalothorax, lined with rasping teeth or plates to grind down swallowed food, and a second, larger stomach may occur within the abdomen, along with organs that supply enzymes to aid in digestion. The anterior limbs on their cephalothorax may now specialize to aid in feeding on their new, much more varied diet. The first two pairs of limbs, once used for sifting through sand for detritus, may now become mandibles to process food and pass it into the mouth, with the setae on these limbs becoming tooth-like cutting surfaces. The third pair of limbs may become pedipalps, which may have a role in both handling food items as well as sensing the environment. The tips of these pedipalps may contain chemical receptors to smell and taste food before it's ingested, and the setae on these limbs, used in the marine sarcopods to sense vibrations, may now specialize into a hearing mechanism. Speaking of senses, since air is constantly being drawn into the lungs, a ring of olfactory receptors around their spiracles will help detect scents carried on the breeze, thus giving their sense of smell a much greater range. These sarcopods are now adapted to a fully terrestrial existence, and are poised to exploit the as-of-yet vacant megafaunal niches. I'll call this clade the osteopods. Together with the chemophytes and lophostomes, they'll serve as the blueprint for innumerable land-dwelling lineages to come. It will have taken about 100 million years to gain a foothold on land, but now they're fully equipped to populate the nascent terrestrial ecosystems. In the next episode, we'll see how these pioneering land dwellers undergo an explosion of diversity into a myriad of new clades.
出発するよ。隠密行動を心がけてね。
In the last episode, we saw how the chemophytes, tentaclostomes, and sarcopods underwent the adaptations necessary to leave the water behind and become the first organisms to live exclusively on dry land. But evolution isn't a linear process, and as these groups make the transition to land, they'll continuously diversify to fill the myriad niches offered by their new terrestrial habitat. To begin with, the environment our alien organisms find themselves in, having emerged from the water, will be warm, wet, and tropical. Our alien planet has a higher average temperature than Earth and less seasonal variation. Plus, the abundant hydrogen sulfide undergoes a series of reactions in the upper atmosphere to form sulfuric acid, around which will condense voluminous clouds that bring acid rain. On top of that, the high temperatures and single enormous oceans serve as a mechanism for generating gigantic storm systems called hypercanes, larger than any storms seen on Earth. All of these factors mean the mainland will be perpetually drenched by massive bouts of acid rain, which will erode the mountains into weather-beaten crags and valleys and carve out huge river courses and deltas, and much of the land will be taken up by waterlogged marshes and bogs. This warm, wet climate will be ideal for the chemophytes, which will pave the way for the first terrestrial ecosystems. Just as in the oceans, the primary energy sources for terrestrial organisms will be sunlight and atmospheric hydrogen sulfide, both of which are used by the chemophytes to power their autotrophic reactions. The first chemophytes will be small, slime mold-like organisms, no more than a few centimeters tall at the most. But the clade from which the terrestrial plants descend, which we'll call xenophytes, will evolve the specialized tissues necessary to grow roots and stems to take up minerals from the soil and grow upwards to gather more sunlight. And one clade of these plants, which we'll call the xylophytes, may then evolve tough support tissues to let them grow into the first trees. Before the animals come ashore, there'll be nothing around to eat these plants, with one notable exception. Saprotrophs are organisms that absorb nutrients from dead or decaying organic matter. The most recognizable saprotrophs on Earth are fungi, but saprotrophy also exists among bacteria and even some plant species as well. In these ancient forests, dead plant matter represents an as-of-yet unexploited source of nutrients, so it's very likely that the clade chemophyte will evolve a saprotrophic lifestyle. The chemophytes may be especially suited for saprotrophy because organic decomposition gives off hydrogen sulfide, from which chemophytes derive a portion of their energy. One clade of chemophyte may adapt their roots to absorb more hydrogen sulfide and other nutrients from the bountiful leaflet that covers the forest floor. As they specialize for this mode of nutrition, they may no longer rely on photosynthesis to obtain sugars, and so their leaves may shrink, possibly even forsaking their algal symbiotes and so losing their reddish coloration. These chemophytes, which I'll call necrophytes, will be the first terrestrial decomposers, organisms that break down the detritus in the ground and recycle the nutrients, a role vital for all ecosystems. Things will remain this way until the tentaclostomes launch their invasion of land, which is likely to occur alongside or very shortly after the first terrestrial plants. The early amphibious forms may flourish around the water's edge, but the lophostomes will have the advantage in inland habitats. The first lophostomes will likely be adaptable generalists, since they won't have had much time to specialize for living in the forests. In this new environment, their survival rates may be fairly low, so they'll be incentivized to reproduce quickly and frequently to maintain a stable population. This strategy of rapid reproduction is sometimes called R-selection. R-selected species are those who produce large numbers of offspring, of which only a small proportion survive. R-selected species tend to be small, have short lifespans, and often thrive when colonizing new habitats. The sessile anthostomes also exhibit this mode of reproduction with their broadcast spawning, and so the lophostomes may inherit similar reproductive tendencies, producing thousands of eggs in a single spawning, the majority of which will die before reaching maturity. As these lophostomes proliferate, they'll undergo a spurt of rapid diversification to fill all the various available niches, what's called an adaptive radiation. One clade of lophostomes may exploit the niches of small-bodied creatures, shrinking down to only a few centimeters long. Below a certain size, their shell won't provide any decent protection, and so isn't needed and may be lost entirely. A small size also means they won't weigh very much, and so will need comparatively little muscular effort to support themselves, so their stubby legs may become longer and more flexible, which will also let them climb plant stems and burrow through leaf litter. Because they're so low to the ground, even the tiniest variation in terrain may obstruct their line of sight, so their eye stalks may lengthen into periscope-like structures to let them see over obstacles and increase their field of view. These tiny lophostomes will exploit similar niches to those filled by arthropods on Earth, and, much like the arthropods, they may reach staggering levels of diversity. Arthropods account for over 80% of all animal species. The total species count of all chordates, mollusks, flatworms, and roundworms combined wouldn't even be equal to the number of beetle species alone. We'll touch on this again later, but one of the primary drivers of biodiversity is habitat variation, which is much more appreciable on small scales, so our tiny lophostomes may reach levels of profusion comparable to the arthropods. Also like arthropods, they may maintain the R-selected tendencies of the earlier lophostomes, as R-selection tends to be favoured at small body sizes, since the only real way they can defend themselves against larger predators is to reproduce faster than the rate at which their predators can eat them, much like the tachypods that constitute the majority of marine plankton. I'll call these tiny creatures malacoforms. Their diversity may be too great to adequately catalogue, but we can still map out several major lineages. Early on in their evolution, some clades may specialize for feeding on plants, forming the first link in the food chain. Some may evolve their manipulator limbs into cutting tools to crop and process the softer tissues around the leaves and branches, while others may evolve compact, robust mouth parts to bore through the harder tissues around the stems and roots, while still others may evolve a proboscis ringed with sharp serrations to pierce the plant's outer cuticles and suck out the nutrient-rich vascular fluids. As these herbivorous clades establish themselves, other clades of malacoforms may evolve to feed on them. Some may adapt their tentacles into sharp, fang-like claws for impaling and butchering prey, while others may evolve longer, whip-like tentacles to ensnare and restrain their prey. And some may evolve to become scavengers or detritivores, feeding on carrion and decaying organic matter along with the necrophytes. Each of these groups may contain thousands of species, and they'll form the basis of just about every terrestrial ecosystem across the planet. While the malacoforms may be incredibly diverse, other lophostome clades may maintain a decent size as well as a hard shell. And as the oxygen levels increase with the proliferation of the forests, they'll be poised to attain comparatively large body sizes, though they'll still be limited by their lack of skeletal support structure and inefficient breathing mechanism. At their size, they won't need long eye stalks to see further, so they may shrink into compact muscular turrets to reduce their likelihood of being damaged, though they can still be swiveled forward and back to increase their field of vision. And as these forms specialize for terrestrial life, one clade may see a radical innovation in their digestive systems. We've said the entire gastrozoan branch of the anthostome evolutionary tree has a blind gut, meaning they eat and excrete waste out of the same opening. This isn't very efficient, since newly swallowed food gets mixed in with food that's already been digested. On Earth, many clades have secondarily evolved a through gut from an ancestral blind gut, so the same thing may happen in the lophostomes. Perhaps in one innovative clade, the gut evolves a sort of partition to form into a U-shaped tract with separate canals for ingestion and excretion. This development will help them extract more nutrients from their food than other clades, and so these lophostomes, which I'll call diplostomes, may become the dominant group of large land animals in these ancient forests. A larger body size may also result in these diplostomes shifting from R selection to K selection. Instead of reproducing in vast numbers like R-selected species, K-selected species produce fewer offspring, but invest more heavily in those offspring to foster a higher chance of them surviving. K-selection tends to be favoured by species that are large, have relatively long lifespans, or live in crowded ecosystems or at high population densities. The diplostome's increasing size may therefore occur alongside a decrease in the number of fertilized eggs they produce in any given clutch, from the several thousand eggs in the ancestral lophostomes to only a few hundred or even several dozen in larger. Keep in mind R and K selection exists on a spectrum, and most species will exist somewhere between the two extremes, and some species may even alternate between them. For instance, the chemophytes reproduce asexually to let them colonize new or sparsely populated habitats, like an R-selected species. But in areas that are already colonized or densely populated, they switch to sexual reproduction to maximize genetic variation, and they package their fertilized spores within a diaspore to increase their chances of survival, like a K-selected species, which is actually very similar to what many species of fungi do on Earth. The diplostomes may become increasingly K-selected as they evolve larger body sizes, which will be facilitated by the increase in atmospheric oxygen as well as their efficient digestive systems. An immediate advantage provided by their complex guts is an improved ability to cope with the tough, indigestible tissues of large plants, and so most early diplostomes may be herbivorous. One clade may specialize for herbivory by evolving some of their feeding arms into long tentacles to reach for food, while the remaining arms may broaden and become covered with row upon row of grasping teeth for masticating vegetation before swallowing. The abundance of food in the ancient forests may let this clade further increase in size to the upper limit of what their boneless bodies will allow. As they grow larger, their legs may thicken with rings of muscle to support a greater weight, possibly losing the
攻撃
ability
支
to be
援をかけ
retracted
た
within the
私
body.
にぴったりの仕
But
事
the
ですわ
evolution of large herbivores will create a niche for predators that feed on them, and so it will only be a matter of time before one clade of diplostomes evolves
そんな
carnivory.
に私を避
This
けなくて
transition
も
may
大丈
begin
夫
with
で
a
す
clade
ね
that evolves to supplement their diet by
あ
subsisting
な
on
た
the
方のためにプ
lactoforms
レ
or
ゼ
by
ントを用
scavenging
意しました
carrion,
の
gradually
気
becoming
に入ってい
generalist
ただけるかし
omnivores. These species may be smaller than their herbivorous cousins, and so won't be quite as robustly built, and their generalist lifestyle may require more mobility than dedicated herbivory, involving behaviors such as digging or climbing, so their shells may become thinner and narrower so as to not hinder their movement. We'll call these creatures stenostricans, which form a sister clade to the fully herbivorous diplostomes or plecostricans. One clade of stenostricans may fill the niches of adaptable opportunists, while the plecostricans continuously and indiscriminately gorge on the bountiful vegetation. These creatures may be more selective in their feeding, so some of their tentacles may evolve into antennae packed with sense organs to probe the leaf litter for anything edible. Eventually, however, another clade of stenostricans may complete the transition to carnivory by specializing to feed on larger
この
prey,
毒は
becoming the first
ゆ
ever
っくりと
terrestrial
あなた方の
macropredator.
命を蝕
This
みます
transition may be facilitated by one major development. Being apex predators, defense is the priority for this clade, while speed and maneuverability are critical to successful hunting. So this new predatory clade may reduce their shells even further than other stenostricans. But rather than losing the shell completely like the melanoforms, they may instead internalize it as a rigid structure within their body. Since the shell no longer provides any protection, it may become diminished into a long, flexible structure that provides internal support, much like the gladius of squids, or indeed like the backbones of vertebrates.
この死
This
骸た
structure
ち
now serves as a site of
一
muscle
瞬で
attachment,
溶かしてし
giving
まう
them
こと
greater
もできま
leverage
す
and
ので
making walking much more efficient.
見てみたいか
They
し
still
ら
won't be able to run with any great speed, but they'll easily outpace the bulky herbivores they feed on. To pierce through their prey's armor, their tentacles may truncate and become lined with tooth-like barbs to deliver powerful bites. I'll call these forms coleostricans. In response to these new predators, the other diplostome clades will need to undergo defensive adaptations. The large plecostricans may simply thicken their shells and evolve extra armor, while the smaller omnivorous stenostricans will still need to maintain a degree of flexibility, so they may divide their shells into bands to provide protection without restricting their movement, possibly even evolving the ability to curl into a defensive ball. I'll call this clade the desmostricans. All of these various clades of Lophostome will enjoy millions of years of unrivaled dominion over the land, before the sarcopods come ashore to challenge their supremacy. Like the early Lophostomes, the first osteopods will likely tend towards our selection to help them quickly colonize their new habitat, and to that end, they might employ a unique reproductive capability. We said in part 2 that the ancestral polypod was dioecious, that is, having a distinction between male and female individuals. But what if we add a slight variation to this? What if, like some species of fish, amphibians, and arthropods on Earth, the sarcopods and the osteopods from which they descend exhibit sequential hermaphroditism, wherein they may alter their sex at some point during their life cycle? This contrasts with the Lophostomes, whose larvae don't have any sexual characteristics at all, and it's only once they reach maturity that they become either male or female and remain as that sex for the rest of their lives. The osteopod sequential hermaphroditism may provide an advantage because in any population where the proportion of males and females is unbalanced, an individual can change their sex to increase the likelihood of finding a mate and helping the population remain stable. Unlike the early Lophostomes, the first osteopods will evolve among an already crowded ecosystem, so for the osteopods to adapt to any terrestrial niches, they'll need to compete with the dominant Lophostome clades. But the osteopods are provided with a considerable advantage from their internal skeletons and efficient breathing systems, which will grant them much greater potential size and maneuverability than the Lophostomes. As the skeleton evolves, the osteopods may split into two lineages. One may evolve multiple flexible limb girdles for increased mobility and speed, while the other may evolve a single fused limb girdle to support a larger body size. We'll call these two lineages Poliscians and Siniscians respectively. The early Poliscians will be small and adaptable omnivores, relying on their speed and agility to survive. while the Siniskians' robust skeletons will allow them to specialize for the niches of large ground dwellers, rapidly becoming the biggest land animals on the planet. As they get larger, their feet will broaden, since if the feet are too narrow, they'll sink into the ground, which would be especially problematic in the muddy swamps that cover much of the landscape. Unlike tetrapods on Earth, their feet won't bear any digits, instead consisting of a single toe-like claw with gripping surfaces on the underside. Earth's tetrapods inherited their fingers and toes from their lobe-finned fish ancestors, but the sarcopods from which the osteopods descend have hydraulic feet instead of fins and have no digits to speak of, so the osteopods will likewise be toeless. The rise of these new clades will spark an evolutionary battle between the lophostomes and the osteopods for dominance of the terrestrial ecosystems. The competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy the same niche in the same ecosystem without one outcompeting the other. None of the lophostome clades can attain the same size that the Siniskians can, nor do they have the speed and maneuverability of the Peliscians, and so they may begin losing ground, but extinction isn't the only possible outcome. Niche partitioning is the process whereby species competing for the same niche undergo adaptations for a more specific realization of that niche, such that they can coexist. For example, the various species of animals found on the Caribbean islands, while all filling the general niche of tree-dwelling insectivores, avoid competition with each other by living in different microhabitats defined by specific types of vegetation and levels of sunlight and moisture. The competing clades of lophostomes and osteopods may do something similar, evolving to live in different habitats and competing for different resources. For example, the Desmostricans and Peliscians, both comprising adaptable omnivores, may avoid competition with each other by specializing for different diets. The Peliscians may take advantage of their mobility to climb and live among tree branches, where they may feed on leaves and mixed plant matter in addition to scavenging and hunting small prey. Their mandibles may broaden into chisel-like structures to help cope with a variety of food items, as well as to chew through the tough outer cuticles of the trees in search for wood-boring malacophores. To help them climb trees and clamber over rough terrain, the gripping surfaces on their feet may evolve claws, and their limbs may lengthen to span the gaps between branches. Living in trees also serves as a defensive adaptation, as they'll be out of reach of many of the large ground predators, and many species may complement this with camouflage patterns to let them blend into the red leaves of the surrounding foliage. These will be some of the first ever arboreal animals, living in a similar way to rodents or prosimians. I'll call these creatures platydonts. The competition from these adaptable osteopods may have an impact on the Desmostricans, possibly resulting in many generalist species going extinct and forcing the remaining species to adopt a more specialized lifestyle. They won't be able to exploit tree climbing niches nearly as well as the platydonts, and so may instead remain at ground level and specialize to feed on the abundant malacophores among the leaf litter, especially since the malacophores don't require very much speed to prey upon. On Earth, animals that occupy analogous niches may be called insectivores, but of course, on this alien planet, there are no insects. So for our purposes, I'm going to coin the term malacovore to describe their feeding habits. To specialize for this lifestyle, some of their tentacles may elongate into whip-like organs to snap up any malacophores they unearth, which will then get crushed between the grinding surfaces of the two spade-like lower tentacles. Since this lifestyle demands less mobility than that of their adaptable ancestors, they may become bulkier and more heavy-set, forsaking a life clambering among the understory and now remaining exclusively at ground level. Similarly, the Plecostricans may avoid competition with the herbivorous Siniskians by specializing to feed on different types of vegetation. The Siniskians may take advantage of their size to exploit the niches of large browsers, evolving long pedipalps to reach into high branches. These pedipalps may terminate in hooked claws to pull leaves towards the muscular mouth, and their cephalothorax may enlarge to accommodate an expanded foregut to tackle tough, woody vegetation. We'll call these lumbering beasts megalobrachids. These adaptations, along with their great size, will mean the megalobrachids will be able to feed on vegetation well out of the Plecostricans' reach. So the Plecostricans may respond to this by specializing for the niches of heavy grazers, feeding on low vegetation on the forest floor, and as such, their feeding tentacles, no longer used to reach upward for food, may become shorter and used for foraging among leaf litter or digging for roots. Among predatory clades, niche partitioning may drive the evolution of new hunting tactics. If a clade of Peliscians evolves to become predators, they may make use of their speed to
任務を
specialize
振
in
り分
pursuit
けるね
hunting. Their hind legs may elongate and align to become parallel with the body for a more directional application of force,
出
allowing
発
them to
するよ
accelerate explosively.
隠密行動
Their
を
eyes
心
may
が
move
けて
forward
ね
towards the front of the cephalothorax to provide them with increased depth perception,
あれ
and their pedipalps may evolve sharp cutting surfaces to butcher their kills. This collection of traits will give them the speed and weaponry to chase down fast quarry like the Platodonts, and to exploit similar niches to those occupied by foxes and other canids on Earth. I'll call them dromeopods. The dromeopods may outcompete many of the predatory coleostracans, but those that survive may avoid competition by specializing for ambush tactics. Their gladius may evolve to become increasingly lighter and more elastic, so that when the muscles within the back contract, they bend the gladius into a curve, storing energy like a bow, and when the muscles release, the gladius snaps back into its original shape, propelling the animal forward in a sort of bounding lunge. This may lead to them evolving a bizarre inchworm-like mode of locomotion, as well as an impressive jumping ability, which they may make ample use of to escape larger predators or to ambush prey. Many species may undergo further niche partitioning by evolving to live among tree branches that are too high or precarious for the dromeopods, which are primarily adapted for life in the understory. Their walking legs may lose their weight-bearing capabilities and evolve to grip and cling to tree branches like forceps, as well as to anchor themselves in place when lunging at prey. With these adaptations, these diplostomes, which I'll call elastospondals, will become the most mobile lophostomes yet, perhaps sufficient to become prolific arboreal ambush predators, feeding on the malacoforms and platodonts they share the trees with. The megalobrachids, however, may be too large to serve as suitable targets for either the elastospondals or the dromeopods, which are specialized for hunting small, fast prey. But once again, where there's a gap in the food chain, something will inevitably evolve to fill it. In this case, early on in the Siniskians' history, the same stock from which the megalobrachids diverged may give rise to a clade of large carnivores. They may use their strong pedipalps to grab and restrain prey, while their eyes, much like those of the dromeopods, may cluster towards the front of the cephalothorax to help them zero in on prey. Their mandibles may lengthen and become more heavily muscled, while their teeth may extend and sharpen to slice through flesh. These creatures will become the new apex predators of these early ecosystems, and the largest carnivores of their time. However, despite their size and ferocity, they may still retain some of the omnivorous tendencies of the ancestral Siniskians, allowing them to subsist on vegetation or carrion if need be, somewhat like bears or the extinct entelodonts on Earth. We'll call these creatures Deinognathans. And with that, our terrestrial ecosystems are looking fairly well fleshed out, and our two-body plan pursues some major developments along the way. As always, keep in mind that these are only the major groups we're detailing here, and there are likely to be innumerable other clades that come and go alongside them. This will serve as a rough outline of the sorts of ecosystems that may develop in the first 50 million years or so following the appearance of the first lophostomes. But there are omens of change on the horizon. The climate is becoming cooler and drier, and the tropical forests are thinning. The stable, hospitable habitats our species have thrived in thus far won't last forever, and so these clades will need to adapt to a changing world or face extinction. In the next episode, we'll see how these clades leave the ancient forests behind and undergo further diversification to conquer a variety of new habitats across the supercontinent. Last time, we saw the development of the first terrestrial ecosystems within the vast, humid forests that cover the supercontinent, supported by a warm, wet climate of unceasing rain and storms. But it's only a matter of time before these stable, benign conditions begin to change. As the forests fill the atmosphere with oxygen, they'll simultaneously take in enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. Thus far, the levels of these gases have been maintained by the aerobic respiration of animals and by the activities of sulfur-metabolizing microbes, respectively. But the globe-spanning forests may deplete these gases faster than they can be replenished. On top of that, as the mountains are eroded by acid rain, the newly exposed rock reacts with the carbon dioxide to form calcites, further lowering atmospheric CO2 levels. Since carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, a decrease in its abundance will lead to an overall cooling of the planet's climate. The enormous storms that deliver rain to the center of the supercontinent rely on high oceanic temperatures, and even a drop of only a few degrees will be enough to disrupt weather patterns. Add in that lowered hydrogen sulfide levels slow the formation of sulfuric storm clouds in the upper atmosphere, and the production of the hypercanes that have fueled the growth of the global forests will come to a halt, and the inland regions of the supercontinent will be starved of water, and thus the forests will dwindle, giving way to vast tracts of open prairies and plains. And although the necrophytes and malacoforms will return a portion of the carbon and sulfur content of the tree's tissues to the atmosphere through decomposition, the remainder will become sequestered underground as the trees become fossilized, effectively removing them from the carbon and sulfur cycle, meaning the original atmospheric levels can't be recovered. Many species may not survive this environmental upheaval, and those that do will need to adapt to an entirely different world. Note, however, that due to the fact that this transition takes place quite gradually, the resulting decrease in biodiversity won't be significant enough for it to qualify as a full-blown mass extinction. But don't worry, we'll cover those in much more detail in a future episode. One of the most obvious changes in this new world will be in the vegetation. The once expansive forests will now only exist near the coasts and around lasting sources of fresh water, while in drier habitats the trees will be replaced by scrublands of mixed caulophite species. These plants, being significantly smaller than trees, don't require nearly as much water, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide, and so have an edge in the new climate. But they're also likely to strengthen their advantage with several important adaptations. All chemophytes have a central body, which in xenophytes is surrounded by a tough, waxy cuticle, and in xylophytes is strengthened by rigid support tissues. Unlike most plants on Earth, which grow gametangia from the tips of their branches, chemophytes' gametangia grow out from the main plant body. The leaves grow from a single meristem, or region of tissue growth, at the top of the plant to maximize their exposure to sunlight. However, if the meristem is damaged, either by being eaten or simply trampled, then the plant won't be able to grow new leaves and so will more than likely die. For a full-grown tree, this isn't a very prevalent danger, because the meristem will be too high up to be within reach of any herbivore. But for smaller plants, the meristem is much more vulnerable. One clade of caulophite may solve this problem by having the meristem occur close to or even below the ground level, which can be achieved by shrinking the size of the plant body, with only the large prominent leaves emerging from the soil. Like all chemophytes, these new plants will be capable of asexual reproduction, which will let them spread very quickly across the newly opened habitats as the trees disappear, possibly forming huge clonal colonies in many areas. And when carrying out sexual reproduction in more densely populated habitats, the gametangia may grow out from the subterranean plant body into long stalks to maximize the dispersal of gametes. This clade of caulophite, which I'll call brachyphytes, will become the dominant ground vegetation across the supercontinent, growing anywhere too dry for trees. These areas will be somewhat similar to grasslands on Earth, though since there's no actual grass, I'll refer to them using the more general term steppe. This new biome will cultivate a completely new assemblage of niches, which the recently evicted forest-dwelling species will furiously compete for. Among the lophostomes, the tiny malacoforms may survive the transition by dint of their extreme diversity and adaptability, but the diplostomes may be doomed to a much slower recovery, since they relied on the forests to maintain the high atmospheric oxygen levels they need to attain large sizes, and with the forests gone, oxygen levels will steadily fall, shrinking the diplostomes' maximum size and forcing them to surrender the megafaunal niches to the osteopods. The slow and bulky plecostricans may survive as small generalist grazers, relying on their sturdy shells for protection, and the desmostricans may maintain their lifestyle of dedicated malacivores. The elastospondylls, however, are specialized for life in the treetops, so as the forests disappear, they may be forced to explore new survival strategies. The elastospondyl's springy gladius lets them execute powerful jumps to pounce on prey as well as to leap between branches, which makes them a prime candidate for one particular development. On Earth, many arboreal species have independently evolved a membrane of skin, or patagium, that lets them glide from tree to tree, as seen in animals like flying squirrels, flying lizards, and even flying snakes. While there are some models that posit that gliding can evolve from a ground-dwelling ancestor, And while there are occasional oddities like flying fish and flying squid, the preponderance of arboreal gliders seems to indicate that the most common pathway to the evolution of a patagium is as a means of jumping between trees. The elastospondylus therefore seem very likely to evolve a patagium to augment their already powerful jumps, increasing the time they can remain airborne and the distance they can cover in a single bound, as well as to provide a degree of safety if they were to fall from a great height, acting like a parachute to slow their descent. To support a larger patagium, the middle pairs of limbs may become longer and broader, and outgrowths of the gladius may extend into the patagium to allow it to maintain its shape when outstretched, somewhat like the hyperextended ribs or ossified filaments found in many clades of living and extinct gliding reptiles. Altering the position of the limbs to influence the shape of the patagium may even allow them to manipulate their trajectory as they glide, and if this is the case, it seems very likely that one clade may take this development to its obvious culmination. While gliding has evolved over a dozen times in the history of life on Earth, powered flight, wherein the animal can remain airborne indefinitely, only has 4 known instances of having evolved. With the exception of insects, whose evolutionary path to flight isn't fully understood, wings have universally evolved from a patagium supported by an elongated and heavily muscled forelimb. But the elastospondyl's unique physiology may lead to them evolving a rather unorthodox method of flight. If the sites of major muscle attachment occur towards the posterior end of the animal to pull the gladius backwards, it may be more likely for the musculature necessary to power flight to develop around the 2 pairs of hind limbs, while the front 2 pairs of limbs provide stability and control pitch. As unusual as this method of flight is, there is some precedent for it in animals on Earth, as seen in the awesomely weird fossil reptile Charavipteryx, which, although incapable of powered flight, formed the bulk of its gliding surface with its hind legs while using its front legs as stabilizers, reminiscent of the canards on a delta wing aircraft. The flying elastospondylus may begin with a similar configuration of patagium before developing the musculature to generate the lift needed for true flight, becoming the first flying animals on the planet. To specialize for flight, their bodies will need to become more streamlined, and so their eye stalks and oral tentacles may shorten to reduce drag. Efficient flying will also put a huge demand on their metabolism, as flight is a very high energy activity and requires a number of physiological adaptations to sustain. First of all, the Lophostome's mechanism of passive respiration may not give them the high stamina needed for flying, especially with atmospheric oxygen levels declining. However, these flying elastospondylus may overcome this by exploiting a unique quirk of their anatomy. As they fly, the contractions of the posterior muscles will cause the gladius to undulate, which successively constricts and expands the lungs, pumping air in and out and providing them with more oxygen. This can be complemented by evolving specialized breathing muscles in the thorax, giving them a system of active respiration similar to that of the osteopods, and thus enabling much more efficient flight. This innovation may coincide with a change in their metabolism. All the animals we've seen so far are ectotherms, sometimes described as cold-blooded, meaning their internal body temperature is almost entirely contingent on the ambient temperature of their environment. However, the metabolic reactions needed for sustained muscular activity are most efficient at a consistent high temperature, which ectotherms can only achieve in sufficiently warm climates and by spending long periods of the day basking in the sun. This constraint means that our elastospondylus will only be able to fly in short bursts if their body isn't suitably warm, so to optimize their flight performance, they may evolve some form of thermoregulation, the ability to modulate internal body temperature to keep it within a metabolically favorable range. Thermoregulation is often used synonymously with endothermy, where an internal temperature is almost always constant, only ever varying within a few degrees, as is done in mammals and birds. But some animals fall between the two extremes of ectotherm and endotherm, and thus sometimes get called mesotherms. For example, regional endotherms only maintain an elevated temperature within certain metabolically demanding areas of the body. Some clades of fish, like lamniform sharks and tuna, use countercurrent heat exchange between blood vessels to warm the areas around the eyes and locomotor muscles, ensuring they can function optimally even in cold waters. And many flying insects warm up their thorax by rapidly contracting the opposing muscles without moving the wing, generating heat in a similar way to the shivering reflex in mammals and birds. We'll discuss thermoregulation in more detail later, but something similar to the latter mechanism might evolve in the flying elastospondylus. Specialized muscles within and around the wing membrane may engage whenever the wing's temperature drops below a certain threshold, decreasing the reliance on warm environments for efficient flying, which combined with their active respiration will enable them to sustain prolonged periods of long-distance flight. As the first flying animals in the planet's history, these elastospondylus will have all the aerial niches to themselves, and so may be hugely successful and undergo an explosion of diversity, which we'll explore in future episodes. Let's call them Opisthopterans. Meanwhile, on the ground below, the osteopods will need to find their own way to adapt to the changing landscape. One of the immediate pressures imposed by the steppe is that, without the cover of the forest vegetation, animals will be much more visible and vulnerable to predators, encouraging the evolution of new defensive adaptations. No longer bound by the dense forest vegetation, some herbivores, like the megalobrachids, may respond to increased predation by getting bigger, as a large size acts as a deterrent to attackers. Plus, it comes with the added benefits of an expanded feeding envelope, letting them feed on vegetation out of reach of other herbivores, and it acts as a method of thermoregulation by increasing the amount of body heat they generate. But attaining an especially large size requires several key adaptations. First of all, our old friend the square cube law means that doubling an animal's size will increase its volume, and therefore its weight, by a factor of 8. And to support this extra weight, the legs will need to become 2.83 times thicker. As the creature gets larger and larger, the legs will eventually become so thick that it will be impossible to maintain the enormous amount of muscular energy required to move them. Having a skeleton helps a great deal in increasing maximum size, as bones are much better at withstanding compressive forces than pure muscle. But optimizing the weight-bearing potential of these bones requires a change in their arrangement. Most of the osteopods we've seen so far have limbs that are splayed out to the side of the body, like many amphibians, reptiles, and arthropods on Earth. This sprawling posture provides a wide, stable base that reduces the chances of falling over, but it can't support a great amount of weight, although on our alien planet this constraint is slightly alleviated by the low gravity, such that the native fauna may support themselves with a more splayed posture than animals of equivalent size would need on Earth. But as the animal gets heavier, the most efficient way to support the extra weight is for the limb joints to move closer to the sagittal plane, or central line of the body, which reduces the amount of muscle power needed to stay upright and relieves the torque imposed on the joints. Beyond a certain weight, for the animal to be able to stand at all, the legs need to be positioned directly under the body and perpendicular to the ground. On Earth, this development occurred independently among archosaurs and stem mammals, which would later allow both groups to achieve immense sizes, so the same innovation might occur among the steppe-dwelling megalobrachids. Beyond the biomechanical constraints, a larger body also needs a greater amount of food, so an animal's maximum size will be contingent on the abundance of food in its habitat. This may preclude many of the larger species from colonizing the sparse inland regions towards the center of the supercontinent, but the areas along the edges of the coastal forests may be rich enough in vegetation to fuel the growth of the biggest animals yet to evolve. We'll call these giant megalobrachids titanopods. Once they're established as the dominant herbivores, different clades of titanopods may specialize for different modes of feeding. The forest-dwelling megalobrachids from which the titanopods descend were primarily browsers, using their elongated pedipalps to reach for high vegetation. One clade of titanopods may retain similar feeding behaviors, taking advantage of their enormous size to feed on the leaves at the very tops of the trees. And since no other clade can rival them in size, they'll have these browsing niches all to themselves. Free from competition, these forms, which we'll call proceropods, will thrive in areas where stands of trees grow alongside patches of open plains, such as gallery forests that grow around large rivers and lakes. But in areas with fewer trees, the titanopods will need to adapt to feed almost exclusively on the brachyphytes, and thus change their feeding habits to become dedicated grazers. These species won't need to reach upward for food, and so may have shorter legs and smaller pedipalps, indiscriminately stripping the brachyphytes to the ground like giant living lawnmowers. We'll call these creatures baropods. Together, the proceropods and baropods will dominate the niches of large herbivores, but the plains also offer niches for smaller, more adaptable animals. Although most platodonts are adapted to life in the trees, some of the more generalist species may be able to eke out a living on the steppe as the forests disappear, which may give rise to a clade of permanent ground dwellers, which we'll dub Edaphotheres. Just like the megalobrachids, the Adaphithias will be more exposed to predators on the steppe, and so will need to invest in some form of defense. Competition from titanopods may prevent them from reaching large enough sizes to offer substantial protection, but the Adaphithias can instead use their speed and agility to outrun their predators. Once again though, sustained activity is most efficient at high body temperatures, so just like the Opisthophterans, the Adaphithias may evolve a means of thermoregulation, perhaps investing in full-fledged endothermy to give them high energy levels throughout the whole day. However, endothermy does come with a drawback. A constantly high metabolism needs a lot of food to maintain. Whereas ectotherms, like crocodiles, can go for over a year without a meal, endotherms are required to feed much more often, with extreme cases like the American pygmy shrew needing to eat 3 times their own weight in food every day. Fortunately for the Adaphithias though, the steppe offers an abundance of food, and the adaptations they inherit from their platodont ancestors make them well equipped to exploit every available source of nutrients. The forest-dwelling platodonts had a varied diet of mixed plant matter in addition to malacoforms and other assorted small prey. One clade of Adaphithias may remain adaptable generalists, but adopt 2 additional feeding behaviors. Firstly, scavenging. Carrion represents a rich source of protein to supplement their diets, so these Adaphithias may therefore assist the necrophytes and malacoforms in keeping the steppe clean of carcasses. It's important to note that above a relatively small body size, relying on scavenging alone for food becomes impractical, since carrion rarely occurs in quantities sufficient for a large animal to live on exclusively, so most scavengers will still actively hunt prey if carrion isn't readily available. Scavengers often have keen senses to help them detect food over long distances, so in our Adaphithias, the scent receptors lining their spiracles may expand into complex olfactory chambers with a large surface area to increase their sensitivity. To help them reach inside the bodies of carcasses, their pedipalps may become slender and gracile, tipped with taste receptors to probe for fresh meat, and a saw-like arrangement of serrated claws will help them tear chunks of flesh from within. Another feeding behavior these Adaphithias might adopt is oviviry. Eggs are rich in essential nutrients, and the steppe will be littered with the oothecae of megafauna like the titanopods. In addition to helping them locate carrion, their powerful sense of smell may also assist in finding widely scattered nesting sites, even letting them detect eggs that are buried under several centimeters of soil. However, if their slender pedipalps are adapted for cutting and processing meat, they won't be very effective at digging, so to help them unearth buried eggs, the feet on their front walking limbs may become stronger and broader like spades. While still considered omnivores, these feeding behaviors may increase the prevalence of meat in their diet, and therefore most species in this clade will qualify as mesocarnivores, animals who gain between 50 and 70% of their energy from meat and subsist on plant matter for the rest. Let's call these adaptable creatures Eurychirids. But the most plentiful source of food on the steppe is the virtually inexhaustible colonies of brachyphytes, which a second clade of Adaphithias may specialize to feed on exclusively. Their broad teeth, previously adapted to cope with a variety of mixed foliage, will make short work of the brachyphyte's soft, waxy leaves and spongy bulbs. And with sufficient food and the metabolic machinery for high levels of activity, these herbivorous Adaphithias can further invest in speed, possibly undergoing adaptations for cursorial locomotion. Cursorial animals are those that are specialized for high speed or long distance running, which is associated with a number of common developments. First of all, cursoriality is strongly correlated with an erect limb posture, like we saw in the titanopods, which not only allows the limbs to support a larger body size, but also to transfer more force to the ground for more efficient running, so our herbivorous Adaphithias may undergo a similar shift in posture. Secondly, cursorial locomotion is made more efficient by increasing stride length, or the distance between footfalls, which can be extended by making the limbs longer and increasing the range of motion of the joints. Luckily for the Adaphithias, they already have long, flexible limbs, used by their arboreal ancestors to climb trees and reach between branches, making them somewhat pre-adapted for cursoriality. Another way to increase stride length is to alter the posture of the foot. The foot structure of vertebrates on Earth can be broadly divided into 3 forms. Plantigrade walkers keep the foot flat against the ground, which provides stability and effective distribution of weight. digitigrade walkers, on the other hand, walk on their toes with the heel raised off the ground, while ungulagrade walkers stand on the tips of their toes, which are usually elongated and adapted into hooves, which is why in many odd-toed ungulates, what looks like the lower leg is actually a single hyperextended toe. Cursorial locomotion favors the latter two forms, as they essentially serve to add the length of the foot to the stride length. While the skeletal comparisons between vertebrates and osteopods aren't exactly equivalent, these cursorial adaphotheres may evolve longer feet with only a single point of contact with the ground, and their hooked claws, once used for grabbing tree branches, may become blunter and hoof-like to give them purchase against the substrate. Finally, cursoriality benefits from an elongated, flexible spine. In animals like the cheetah, the spine can bend far enough forward for the front and hind limbs to overlap, which allows for the entire length of the body to contribute to stride length as the spine extends. The herbivorous adaphotheres may mimic this by evolving a longer, more flexible body with more space between the limb girdles. All of these adaptations will make these animals, which we'll call leptopods, some of the fastest animals on the steppe. But they won't be the only animals to specialize for speed. With the plains accommodating such an abundance of herbivores, it's inevitable that new predators will evolve to hunt them. Before the climate change, the Deinognathans were at the top of the food chain, but as the steppe spreads, the dense vegetation that they rely on for ambush hunting will disappear. Although they're easily large and powerful enough to hunt prey like the titanopods and leptopods, their great size makes them very easily spotted out in the open, so ambush tactics are no longer a viable option, and the fused, robust limb girdles they have in common with all Siniscians can't articulate very far, so they may be prohibited from specializing for cursoriality. Without the speed to keep up with fast-moving quarry, the Deinognathans may not be able to adapt for predatory niches on the open plains, only surviving within areas of vegetation dense enough to conceal them. On the other hand, the Dromaeopods have already evolved a limb orientation suited for pursuit hunting, and so are in some ways pre-adapted to hunt swift prey on the steppe. Like the leptopods, the active lifestyle of the Dromaeopods may lead to them convergently evolving thermoregulatory mechanisms. But unlike the leptopods, whose activity levels remain more or less constant as they feed on the bountiful brachyphytes throughout the day, the Dromaeopods will oscillate between periods of high activity when hunting and long spans of low activity between hunts. To make thermoregulation more economical, they may adopt another form of mesothermy. Facultative endotherms only regulate their temperature under certain energetically favorable conditions. For instance, hummingbirds have the highest metabolisms of all vertebrates, letting them power the extraordinarily rapid movement of their wings for extended periods. But when resting, or in the absence of sufficient food, the energetic demands of thermoregulation are no longer practical or necessary to maintain, and so their internal body temperature plummets. Likewise, our Dromaeopods may only thermoregulate when hunting for optimal performance, while between hunts or when food is scarce, they may cease thermoregulation to conserve energy. To augment their already impressive speed, the steppe-dwelling Dromaeopods may undergo similar cursorial specializations to the leptopods, including an erect posture, elongated limbs, and a flexible spine, but they may gain a further advantage from one particular adaptation. All osteopods have one pair of pedipalps, used to sense the environment and to handle food, and 4 pairs of walking legs, inherited from their sarcopod ancestors. Among terrestrial body plans on Earth, the number of limbs present is wildly variable, ranging anywhere from 0 to multiple hundreds. While the minimum number of legs needed for a cursorial animal is only 2, having additional legs increases the animal's stability by creating a wider base. However, extra legs require extra energy to maintain the necessary musculature, with diminishing returns for every additional pair of legs. On Earth, terrestrial megafaunal niches are exclusively occupied by vertebrates, almost all of which have 4 limbs, so it's difficult to know how viable a large cursorial species with more than 4 walking limbs would be, but it seems likely that to maximize speed and minimize unnecessary energy expenditure, the steppe-dwelling Dromaeopods may evolve to run on only 6 legs rather than 8. Initially, these Dromaeopods may use their frontmost pair of walking legs along with their pedipalps to catch and restrain prey. Over time, these legs may lose their locomotive function entirely and be held permanently off the ground, giving them the freedom to be secondarily adapted to aid in manipulation, as happened on Earth in animals like mantids, dinosaurs, kangaroos, and australopithecines. Geert van Dijk, author of the blog on Farahan Biology and Allied Matters, has coined the elegant term centaurism to describe this condition. From here, the limbs may become clawed arms to latch onto fast-moving prey, while the pedipalps may sharpen into fang-like points to deliver the killing blow. This innovation will simultaneously give them the speed and maneuverability to keep pace with the leptopods, and the weaponry to tackle prey as large as the titanopods. These specializations may go along with a shift in diet. Unlike the more generalist Eurychirids, most of which are mesocarnivores, some of these steppe-dwelling dromaeopods may evolve into hypercarnivores, animals that obtain over 70% of their energy from meat. This suite of new adaptations will make these dromaeopods the top predators of their day. I'll call them onychodonts. All of these clades represent only a tiny fraction of the diversity that the steppe will support, but they'll comprise the most populous and successful groups over the 30 million years or so following the retreat of the global forests. But away from the equatorial plains, the disruptions in the planet's climate will have far greater ramifications, felt not only on land, but also in the ocean. In the next episode, we'll see how some of our terrestrial species exploit the newly vacated aquatic niches and undergo the unprecedented transition back into the water. Thanks to Campfire for sponsoring this episode. If you've got your own world-building project, whether it be an alien planet, a medieval fantasy world, or an alternate history, Campfire Pro can be a big help to keep things organized. It has pages for maps, timelines, and encyclopedia entries to manage your world's geography, history, and items of interest, as well as tools to keep track of characters, relationships, plot threads, and other narrative elements. Best of all is the brand new World Building Pack, an expansion that includes entries for languages, religions, magic systems, species, and basically anything else you could possibly want to catalog. You can get Campfire Pro and the World Building Pack for a one-time purchase through the link in the description. Thanks also to the fans over on Discord who submitted fan art for this episode. Links to the main server and the fan art server in the description. And a massive thanks to all the patrons, whose continued support makes videos like this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. This alien planet is brought to you by Campfire Technology. More on that later. Over the past few episodes, we've explored how our alien organisms have colonized and conquered the terrestrial realm. From humble beginnings as unassuming amphibious swamp dwellers, the chemophytes, lophostomes, and osteopods have diversified into a myriad of clades, adapting to every niche the land has yet presented them with. But in the 150 million years since they emerged from the water, their far-flung relatives in the sea will also have been diversifying. And it's about time that we revisited the ocean to see what developments have occurred since we last saw them. To begin with, the basic structure of the oceanic food webs will remain much as it has been for many millions of years. Sunlight provides energy for countless billions of microscopic phototrophs, or phytoplankton, while the atmospheric hydrogen sulfide sustains equally prolific swarms of chemotrophs, which I'll hereafter refer to as chemoplankton. All of these autotrophs will be food for tiny zooplankton like the anthostome larvae and the tachypods, and these in turn will serve as an abundant food source for larger zooplankton like the gastrozoan larvae. But the niches of pelagic nekton will remain almost exclusively occupied by the acanthopods, which first appeared almost 50 million years before the first terrestrial ecosystems, when one clade of early polypods evolved to swim by undulating their bodies from side to side, rather than using their limbs like all other clades of polypod. As briefly discussed in Part 3, the first acanthopods likely used anguilliform locomotion, where undulations pass along the entire length of the body to generate thrust, much like eels, lampreys, and some knifefish. Anguilliform swimmers tend to have elongated bodies of fairly uniform width, so that all parts of the body displace an equal amount of water. Their bodies also tend to be flattened in the direction of undulation to increase surface area and therefore give them greater leverage against the water, essentially turning the whole body into one big fin. Perhaps some basal clades of anguilliform acanthopods still survive to the present, which we'll call orthorhynchids. But anguilliform swimming is a fairly unspecialized form of locomotion, and is most efficient at slow speeds. So as the acanthopods diversify to fill the countless nectonic niches, it's likely that many clades will evolve to become faster. One way to increase swimming speed is to concentrate the lateral movements towards the posterior end of the body. Subcarangiform swimmers only use the rear 2/3 of their bodies to generate thrust, keeping the anterior third comparatively still. Because the majority of the work of displacing water is done by the tail and the hind portion of the body, the fins tend to primarily occur along these regions, while the main body is usually shorter, stiffer, and rounder than in anguilliform swimmers. Although the anguilliform swimming used by the orthorhynchids requires slightly less muscular energy to maintain, subcarangiform swimming grants greater speed, essential for escaping predators and chasing down prey. So if a clade of acanthopod were to evolve this form of swimming, they'll have a distinct advantage in competing for pelagic niches. The earliest representatives of this new clade, which we'll call hadrorhynchids, will likely take advantage of their speed to hunt small nekton, but the most plentiful source of food in the oceans are the vast swarms of plankton that teem near the surface, which one clade of hadrorhynchids may specialize to feed on exclusively, initially preying on large zooplankton like the gastrozoan larvae, before adapting to feed on smaller organisms. The setae on their feeding arms may grow into long, tightly spaced bristles to sieve tiny food particles out of the water. Having such large feathery feeding structures will increase drag and therefore make swimming less efficient, but since, by definition, plankton can't swim away, these hadrorhynchids won't need a great deal of speed or mobility to feed effectively. They can simply swim through the clouds of plankton with their feeding arms open to get all the nutrition they need. And because they have a virtually inexhaustible source of food, they'll be able to attain very large sizes, and the larger they get, the more plankton they'll be able to ingest. And over millions of years, this feedback loop may produce some of the largest species in the ocean, as has happened in many clades of pelagic filter feeders on Earth. However, somewhat similar to the situation with the lophostomes on land, the hadrorhynchids will still be limited in their maximum size by their respiration. The acanthopods breathe by extracting oxygen from the water with the gills that line their bodies. The larger their gill surface, the more oxygen they'll be able to obtain, and therefore the larger they can grow. However, the square cube law once again comes into play here, as the surface area available for gas exchange will become smaller in proportion to their body size as they grow larger, until at some point the gills will need to become impractically huge for them to get enough oxygen to maintain their size. This means that species that breathe using gills, like the hadrorhynchids, will have an upper limit on their maximum size, which animals like the whale shark and the extinct Leedsichthys suggest is somewhere around 15 meters or so. Despite this constraint, these giant filter-feeding hadrorhynchids will become the biggest animals in the oceans and monopolize the niches of large filter feeders. We'll call them tylopods. Meanwhile, another clade of hadrorhynchid may specialize for feeding on nekton, a lifestyle that may involve another change in their mode of swimming. Whereas subcarangiform swimming involves around 2/3 of the animal's body length, in carangiform swimming, thrust is generated by rapidly oscillating only the posterior third of the body. This specialization in swimming style is strongly correlated with a change in body shape. The smaller the portion of the body dedicated to propulsion, the more streamlined the rest of the body becomes, favoring a fusiform or pointed oval-shaped body and a muscular tail bearing a large crescent-shaped or lunate caudal fin. This provides a further increase in speed, but comes at the cost of maneuverability. Unlike anguilliform swimmers, which can execute sharp turns by adjusting the position of their elongated bodies, carangiform swimmers have comparatively little control over their direction of movement. To help them steer and maintain stability, carangiform swimmers usually rely on their fins, which in the case of our hadrorhynchids may evolve from the limbs that line their bodies, which have long since lost their role in propulsion. When moving through a medium like water or air, an animal needs to remain stable along 3 axes of rotation. Firstly, the animal needs to control roll, or side-to-side teetering, which can be achieved by evolving fins that stick out perpendicular to the body. If positioned towards the front or back of the body, these fins also help maintain pitch, or rotating forwards and backwards. Finally, yaw, or turning left and right, can be adjusted with dorsal or ventral fins, which typically occur posterior to the animal's center of gravity. Additionally, the 4 feeding arms common to all acanthopods will present unnecessary drag and decrease their speed and swimming efficiency. So to make them more hydrodynamically optimal, this clade may evolve to keep their feeding arms pressed together into a streamlined cone. You'll probably notice that with all of these constraints taken into account, we've ended up with a body shape quite similar to that of many fish species on Earth. Because of the hydrodynamic pressures exerted by a medium as dense as water, the basic fish shape that we're familiar with on Earth is likely to be common in pelagic nekton on Earth-like planets throughout the universe. On Earth alone, it's independently evolved in cetaceans, marine reptiles, and even sea slugs. Another adaptation strongly correlated with a pelagic lifestyle, even sea slugs. Another adaptation cetaceans, marine reptiles, and even sea slugs. Another adaptation strongly correlated with a pelagic lifestyle is countershading, where the ventral side of the body is more lightly colored than the dorsal side, meaning that when viewed from below, they blend in with the light coming from the water's surface, and when viewed from above, they're camouflaged against the darkness of the deeper layers of the water column. This color pattern benefits both predators and prey, and so is likely to be widespread among many oceanic clades, including among our clade of chorangiform swimmers, which along with their speed and streamlined bodies will help them to become the dominant clade of pelagic predators. We'll call this clade the teleopterids. From here, different clades of teleopterids may specialize for feeding on different types of prey, which is likely to involve modifications to their mouth parts. Another pressure imposed by the density of water is that, when a predator lunges at a prey item, the resulting turbulence may push the prey out of the predator's reach. Aquatic animals on Earth have evolved a variety of different feeding mechanisms to minimize this risk. Some, like groupers and bass, use suction feeding to draw the prey and the surrounding water into the mouth, while others, like the slingjaw wrasse, goblin sharks, and dragonfly larvae, have extendable jaws that can dart forward to grab prey without producing appreciable turbulence. If a clade of teleopterids specializes for feeding on small nekton, they may converge on the latter solution. The middle pair of feeding arms may become streamlined harpoons to dart forward and impale prey, with their setae evolving into sharp, backward-angled spines, while the lateral arms may broaden into robust, tooth-riddled appendages to restrain and butcher prey once it's caught and to pass it into the mouth. This sophisticated armament will equip these hadrobrachids to feed efficiently on small nekton, and will earn their clade the appropriate name, Dorypods. Another clade of teleopterids may specialize for hunting larger prey, which may entail yet another change in their form of swimming. The final and fastest variation of body-driven swimming is thunniform swimming, wherein virtually all the propulsive force is provided by the tail fin, seen in many large predatory species like tuna, barracuda, and some sharks. This form of swimming is also correlated with an elongated, torpedo-like body that allows for rapid acceleration, which will give these teleopterids a substantial edge in competing for the niches of macropredators. Most of the prey species that form these teleopterids' diets are large enough to not be significantly affected by turbulence, so evolving a hydrodynamically optimal feeding mechanism isn't as much as a priority for these macropredators as it is for smaller species like the Dorypods. Instead, the setae lining their feeding arms may evolve into rows of serrated teeth to deliver powerful bites and to rip chunks of flesh from their prey. These teleopterids may gain supremacy over the pelagic ecosystem soon after they first appear, and by the time they've established themselves as top predators, they may be large enough to rival the filter-feeding tylopods in size. We'll dub them temnopods. Faced with the competition from all these new clades, the orthorhynchids may not fare as well, as their anguilliform design doesn't grant them the necessary speed to compete for the niches of active predators in the open ocean, and so many of the pelagic orthorhynchids may be driven to extinction. But some species may still find niches in environments like the shallows along the coasts. In many such places, the marine snow and abundant plankton may cultivate huge reefs of sessile anthostomes, providing a habitat for a unique assemblage of organisms. In some ways, the differences between the reefs and the open ocean is analogous to the differences between the forests and the steppe. In the open sea, where there's virtually no form of cover or shelter, it pays to be optimized for speed, but the complex landscape of the reefs favors specializations for maneuverability. In this regard, the orthorheichids have an advantage, as their angular-form swimming allows them to change direction more rapidly than other forms of body-driven swimming. Many species may retain a long, slender body shape to help squeeze through confined spaces among the stands of anthostomes, but other species may further optimize their maneuverability with yet another change to their manner of swimming. All of the methods of swimming we've discussed so far involve the body and the caudal fin in the production of thrust. But an alternative commonly found in many reef-dwelling fish is to instead achieve propulsion by beating the fins back and forth, keeping the body and tail comparatively motionless. This is called median paired fin swimming, and is generally slower than any of the various forms of body-driven swimming, but the chief benefit that it provides is a much more precise control of movement, which is essential when it comes to navigating the complex terrain of the reefs. Although most acanthopod clades have lost the use of their fins for propulsion and have instead invested in body-driven swimming, some of the reef-dwelling orthorheichids may re-evolve the limb-driven swimming of the ancestral polypod, developing the fins lining their bodies into 7 pairs of broad paddles. Many species of reef-dwelling fish also exhibit a laterally compressed body and enlarged dorsal and ventral fins, giving them a much greater control over their turning, which the orthorheichids may emulate by evolving thin, leaf-shaped bodies with tall fins running along their dorsal surface. Another likely result of adapting to life in the reefs is a change in coloration. In contrast to the countershading frequently seen in pelagic swimmers, reef-dwelling animals often have coloration that helps them blend in with the surrounding terrain, so most orthorheichids may have color patterns to camouflage them against the sediment and the calcareous turrets of the anthostome colonies. While the basal clade of orthorheichids, which we'll call tenipterids, will rely on the cover of the anthostomes to keep them safe, these more derived forms, which we'll call remipterids, will use their agility to evade predators. It's worth noting that each of the modes of swimming we've discussed here are likely to evolve independently in many of these clades, just as how on Earth many unrelated groups of fish have converged on similar swimming methods to suit similar lifestyles. The straightforward linear progression I've presented here is fairly simplified for the sake of clarity, and in practice, any given clade won't be restricted to only one form of swimming. The reefs will offer the orthorheichids protection from larger predators like the temnopods, but they'll have to share these environments with other creatures. One clade very likely to find a home amongst the reefs are the marine tentaclostomes, relatives of the forms that gave rise to the lophostomes. To distinguish them from their terrestrial cousins, I'll refer to the marine forms as lithostracans. Like the ancestral tentaclostomes, these lithostracans aren't very well adapted for swimming, and so can't compete for predatory niches in the open ocean, instead mainly thriving in benthic environments on the seabed. Species in more open habitats may protect themselves from predators by retracting their limbs into their calcareous shell, but in the reefs they may gain more protection from hiding among the stands of sessile anthostomes. In this case, having a large, inflexible shell may become a handicap, as it will prevent them from squeezing through narrow spaces, so much like the malacoforms and the coleostracans on land, some of these reef-dwelling tentaclostomes may lose their shell to give them more flexibility, and to let them access tighter, more secure hiding places. These spaces may also serve as ideal spots for launching ambushes, which they'll rely on for catching prey much faster than themselves. We'll give these shellless creatures the fitting name anostracans. Another likely resident of the reefs will be the marine sarcopods, which, once again, to distinguish from their terrestrial relatives, will give the name coelopods. Much like the lithostracans, these creatures don't have any overt adaptations for swimming, but instead avoid predators by burrowing beneath the sand. The setae lining their limbs are embedded in vibration-sensitive cells or mechanoreceptors to detect movement in the surrounding water, alerting them to incoming danger. The majority of coelopod species are benthic detritivores, feeding on the marine snow and the other organic matter among the sediment, but some species may expand into the many other niches offered by the reefs, possibly even evolving predatory feeding habits. These species may increase the number and sensitivity of the mechanoreceptors along their cephalothorax, with the anterior setae elongating into antenna-like structures, while the mouth parts may adapt for grasping and masticating prey. Lying in wait within their burrows, they may use their sensitive mechanoreceptors to detect vibrations in the water above them. When prey passes overhead, they'll erupt from under the sediment and dispatch it with the tooth-like setae on their oral tentacles. But specializing for the niches of ambush predators may put these colepods in competition with the anostracans, which may mean that the two clades won't exist in the same ecosystems, or that they'll specialize for hunting different species of prey. We'll call these predatory colepods trichopods. Many of these marine clades may also have representatives in freshwater habitats. The various lineages of acanthopods are likely to have independently colonized the inland rivers and marshes, and we'll cover their diversity in more detail in future episodes. But some freshwater inhabitants of particular note are the native tentaclostomes. These species, descended from the same amphibious clades as the terrestrial lophostomes, may retain their ancestors' amphibiousness, able to come out onto the land for short periods, but still needing to return to the water to breed and to stave off desiccation. While most marine tentaclostomes are benthic predators, the line that led to the amphibious clades descended from more generalist species that supplemented their diet by feeding on the early chemophytes. This being the case, many of the freshwater and amphibious species that survive to the present day may be omnivorous, or perhaps even herbivorous. They may graze on the low vegetation along riverbeds and mudbanks, using their long eye stalks to look above the waterline. To distinguish them from their fully terrestrial and marine counterparts, we'll call them mysostomes. The sarcopods may have some surviving amphibious representatives as well. These forms trace their ancestry to swamp-dwelling scavengers, and so their diets may tend more towards carnivory. Notably, they will have diverged from the osteopods before the evolution of internal skeletons, so they won't have any bones and thus won't be able to support themselves on land very effectively. Also, because air is about 800 times less dense than water, vibrations don't propagate through it as appreciably, so their mechanoreceptors won't function nearly as well when on land. On top of that, with the proliferation of the osteopods, the amphibious forms may have trouble competing for terrestrial niches, so all of these factors may consign most species to a life spent predominantly in the water. Many may feed on the mysostomes, using their powerful, robust mouthparts to crack open their shells. Once again, these species will constitute their own clade, distinct from the fully terrestrial osteopods and the marine colepods, and so to differentiate them, we'll call them metaxopods. All of these aquatic clades will flourish over the 120 million years following the invasion of land by the chemophytes, lophostomes, and osteopods, but the steadily changing atmosphere and the subsequent shift in climate will have far-reaching implications for the pelagic ecosystems. The drop in temperatures following the decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels will disrupt the ocean currents, depriving many areas of the sea of oxygen and nutrients, and the diminishing hydrogen sulfide levels will make chemosynthesis less efficient, and so the once abundant chemoplankton may experience a substantial decline in their diversity. Some clades may even be forced to invest in other forms of nutrition, evolving saprotrophic or even fully heterotrophic lifestyles, ensnaring and ingesting other plankton with long ciliated feeding structures. This revolution among the plankton may result in the collapse and restructuring of many of the pelagic ecosystems. In many areas, plankton may not occur in large enough quantities to support the filter feeders, and without them, many of the predatory acanthopods that feed on them may be driven to extinction. It will take several million years for the acanthopods to reclaim their former diversity after the climate stabilizes, but as they do, they may face competition from some rather unexpected adversaries. As well as affecting the oceans, the climate change event will concurrently reshape the terrestrial ecosystems, changing the dominant landscape from lush forests to open steppe. In the last episode, we discussed how some of the osteopods and lophostomes adapted to this new environment, but not all the terrestrial clades will have representatives on the plains. Some groups may not be adaptable enough to compete for niches on the steppe, instead remaining within the surviving regions of forest. Some of these areas, particularly around the equatorial coasts, may still receive enough rainfall to form large swamps and marshes, and these sorts of environments may prompt some of the terrestrial inhabitants to expand into aquatic niches. On Earth, many species that descend from fully terrestrial ancestors have secondarily adapted for life in the water. These sorts of animals are sometimes described as amphibious, but this label can be a bit problematic because it's also used to describe actual amphibians. Alternatively, these animals are sometimes described as amphibious, but this label can be a bit problematic because it's also used to describe actual amphibians. Alternatively, these animals are also often described as semi-aquatic, which is also somewhat problematic as it's quite difficult to rigorously define and encompasses a very broad spectrum of lifestyles, ranging from animals like water voles, which occasionally enter the water to feed on aquatic vegetation, to animals like seals, which spend virtually their entire lives in the water, only coming onto land to breed and to evade predators. On our alien planet, the first step in the transition to a semi-aquatic lifestyle may occur when some of the wetland-dwelling clades undergo adaptations to help them wade or swim across the waterways that pervade their habitat. Some of the most prolific forest dwellers are the adaptable platodonts, most of which spend their lives among the branches of dense foliage. But in the wetlands, stands of trees may be separated by stretches of shallow water, which the platodonts will need to cross periodically to reach new feeding areas. Their elongated limbs, primarily adapted for climbing trees, will make them awkward swimmers, but as they evolve to spend more time at ground level, their legs may become shorter and broader to more effectively serve a paddling lifestyle. And once they evolve to swim effectively, they may expand their diet to include the many food sources that the water offers, like the mysostomes, metaxapods, and freshwater acanthopods. To specialize for preying upon these clades, the platodonts may evolve a more streamlined body shape and the ability to hold their breath for several minutes at a time. As adaptable generalists, comfortable both on land and in the water, these platodonts may be a common sight around many wetland areas across the supercontinent, living in a similar way to otters, muskrats, and platypuses on Earth. Let's call them copitarsons. Along with small generalists like these, semi-aquatic adaptations are also occasionally seen in megafaunal herbivores, like hippos, capybaras, and the extinct desmostylians, so some of the analogous herbivores on our alien planet may see similar developments. While the line leading to the titanopods may thrive on the steppe, some of the more basal clades of megalobrachids may remain within the equatorial jungles, where they'll need to adapt to a climate of high rainfall and regular flooding. Like the copitarsons, these megalobrachids may begin their semi-aquatic transition by adapting to traverse areas of shallow water, which will have the added benefit of granting them access to the aquatic vegetation that grows along the riverbeds. At present, no other large animal feeds on these plants, and so the lack of competition may encourage these megalobrachids to specialize for the niches of large semi-aquatic herbivores. Their elongated pedipalps, once used for reaching upward for food among tree branches, may now be repurposed for reaching downward to forage for underwater vegetation. Their spiracles and sensory organs may migrate towards their dorsal surface, allowing them to breathe and see above the waterline while the bulk of the body is submerged. Although not quite as big or specious as their steppe-dwelling cousins, this radiation of megalobrachids, which I'll name prenobrachids, will still constitute some of the largest megafauna within the swamps and marshes. And with such an abundance of prey in the water, some predators may be incentivized to adopt a semi-aquatic lifestyle as well. On the open plains, the Deinignathans may get outcompeted for predatory niches due to their bulky, inflexible bodies not giving them the speed to chase down fast prey, but they'll still survive within the remaining pockets of woodland, using the cover of the ample vegetation to ambush large prey. In this regard, any areas around lasting sources of fresh water will form ideal hunting grounds, as prey will routinely come to these areas to drink. One early radiation of Deinignathans may evolve to live in these areas exclusively, possibly co-evolving with the prenobrachids, which may serve as their principal source of prey. At this point, they'll live in much the same way as crocodiles, and as such, they may converge on similar adaptations. On Earth, the crocodilian body plan has independently evolved many times among completely unrelated clades, suggesting that it's an optimal design for semi-aquatic ambush predators. One of its signature characteristics are the long yet robust jaws, which are streamlined for efficient swimming and capable of delivering incredibly powerful bites to restrain prey and drag it backwards into the water. The osteopods have a fairly different jaw structure to vertebrates, but the Deinignathans' enormous mandibles are already well suited for seizing large prey. making them somewhat pre-adapted to the niches of semi-aquatic ambush predators. Like the prenobrachids, their eyes may move towards the top of the cephalothorax to let them sense prey above the waterline, and their spiracles may be repositioned on the upper abdomen to let them keep the majority of the body hidden beneath the water. This line of Deinognathans, which I'll call Odontognathans, may rapidly achieve widespread dominance of the freshwater habitats following their first appearance, after which they may diversify into a number of more specialized forms. Most of the early Odontognathan species will be macropredators, feeding primarily on terrestrial prey and other semi-aquatic animals like the prenobrachids. We'll call these forms Trachognathans. But as the group diversifies, some species may avoid competition with their larger relatives by specializing to feed predominantly on the freshwater acanthopods. On Earth, animals with equivalent feeding behaviors are called piscivores, but once again, we run into a bit of terminological trouble here, as strictly speaking, this term is used to describe animals that feed specifically on fish, and there are obviously no fish on this alien planet, so for the sake of exactitude, I'll coin the term acanthivore to describe their lifestyle. Just like the predatory teleopterids, these acanthivorous Odontognathans will need to find a hydrodynamically optimal way of feeding. Because it's a lot harder to get a grip on prey when in water, semi-aquatic piscivores often have noticeably different mouth parts and dentition to their terrestrial relatives, frequently involving elongated jaws with interlocking pointed teeth, and sometimes additional sharp protuberances lining the inside of the mouth. Likewise, these Odontognathans may forego their ancestors' robust jaws and broad serrated teeth, instead evolving narrow, slender mandibles with prominent needle-like teeth. Since most of the job of catching prey is done by the elongated mandibles, the pedipalps may shrink to reduce water resistance, though they may still be used to masticate prey once it's caught and to pass it into the mouth. To let them move more effectively in water, they'll need to evolve an efficient means of swimming, but unlike crocodiles, the Odontognathan's inflexible limb girdles, common to all Stiniscians, may make body-driven swimming difficult to evolve, so it may be more likely for them to adopt a style of swimming similar to the median paired fin swimming seen in the remipterids, propelling themselves with back-and-forth strokes of their powerful limbs. To prevent their airways from flooding when they dive underwater in pursuit of prey, they may evolve specialized muscles to let them constrict their spiracles, similar to the palatal valve seen in crocodiles or seals' ability to open and close their nostrils. This clade of Odontognathans, which we'll call Dolichognathans, will be smaller than the macropredatory Trachognathans, but will still be capable and prolific predators of the acanthopods they share the water with. And because they no longer feed on terrestrial megafauna, they won't necessarily need to stay within close proximity to the land, so some species may expand their feeding areas into the coastal shallows. Initially, they'll be prevented from exploiting pelagic niches by the temnopods, which have been the dominant oceanic predators for over 70 million years. But when the climate changes and the marine ecosystems are thrown into chaos, many of the top-level niches will be left vacant, which may provide an opportunity for the coastal Dolichognathans to colonize deeper waters. Despite their semi-aquatic disposition, the freshwater Odontognathans will